The next few days were uneventful. I settled into a routine, exploring during the day, returning to the cabin in the evening, cooking meals, and reading or writing by the fire. The isolation was both comforting and unsettling. I realized how accustomed I had become to constant human interaction, to background noise, to predictable routines. Out here, I had none of that. Even small things felt significant. The smell of rain-soaked earth, the sight of a hawk soaring above the trees, the sound of water trickling down the stream. But the feeling of being watched never fully went away. Sometimes I would catch a movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that seemed to dart between the trees. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe just my imagination, but the sensation lingered, making me constantly aware of my surroundings. On the fourth night, something changed. It was quiet, eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted. I had built a fire, but it felt insufficient, like a fragile barrier against something I couldn't see. Around midnight, I heard it, the first real sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. A low, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the forest floor outside the cabin. Not the soft, random steps of an animal, but something heavier, measured, approaching slowly. My heart started pounding. I froze, listening. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again, moving around the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the window, shining it into the darkness. Nothing, just the black shapes of trees and the muddy ground, glistening from the rain. I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal, a bear maybe, but the rhythm of the steps didn't match anything I had heard before. It was slow, careful, like whoever or whatever was outside was trying to be quiet, but not quiet enough. I spent the next few hours in a state of high alert, checking every window and door, making sure everything was locked and secured. I had packed a small hunting knife for emergencies, and I kept it close. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made my chest tighten. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I went outside cautiously to see if there were any signs of what had been outside. The ground was wet and muddy, and I could see footprints. Not large enough for a bear, definitely human. They were scattered around the cabin, some leading into the forest and some circling back, but none leading away in a clear path. My stomach sank. Someone had been here in the middle of the night, close enough to the cabin to see me if I had looked out. The thought made the isolation I had once craved feel like a trap. Over the next day, I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was a hunter, someone who had gotten lost in the storm. Maybe it was a hiker passing through. But as the sun set again, I felt the tension returning. I kept the fire going, kept my knife and flashlight close. The wind whispered through the trees, but now I imagined footsteps hidden in it, always just out of sight. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, cleaning, cooking, reading, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, scanning for movement. The forest had turned into a labyrinth of suspicion and fear, and I was trapped in the middle of it. The fifth night was worse. Around 11 p.m., I heard them again. Footsteps circling, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on my jacket, and walked to the door. The steps stopped. Silence. I held my breath, listening. Then, suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest. A branch breaking under weight. The footsteps resumed, closer this time, moving along the edge of the cabin. Panic surged through me. I considered leaving, running into the forest, but I knew that would be foolish. I was completely exposed out there. I thought about climbing into my car, but the keys were inside, and the storm had returned in the form of heavy rain and wind. I was trapped inside, and the sound of someone, or multiple someones, moving around the cabin was deafening in its intimacy. I stayed pressed against the wall, flashlight in hand, waiting for what seemed like hours. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself outside, careful not to trip over the wet ground, and examined the perimeter. More footprints, not just one person, several, and they didn't lead anywhere conclusive, just circling and coming closer at times, then retreating. My heart sank further. By the sixth day, I realized I couldn't stay. The isolation I had sought had transformed into a prison. I packed my things quietly, moving slowly so as not to attract attention. I tried to move as discreetly as possible, keeping my eyes on the forest edges, listening for any sound. When I finally made it to the car, my hands were shaking. I locked the cabin door behind me, half expecting someone to appear from the trees as I drove away. The dirt road was treacherous, slick from rain, but I kept going, adrenaline pushing me forward. Every turn, every shadow, made me flinch, but I kept moving, refusing to stop until I reached the main road. It took hours, but I finally emerged onto a paved highway. I stopped the car and took a deep breath, looking back at the forest in the distance. The cabin was no longer visible, hidden by trees and distance. My body was exhausted, my mind raw from fear and sleepless nights. But I felt relief, a sense of survival that I hadn't experienced in years. I called my friend, explaining I was okay but needed time before I could talk about everything that had happened. The forest was still behind me, but for the first time it felt like a place I had left behind, not a trap I was still inside. I never went back. I stayed in hotels after that, always in cities, surrounded by people and noise, needing the distraction and security. Months later, I thought about the cabin sometimes, about the isolation I had sought and the fear I had felt. It was a stark reminder that being alone in nature was not the same as being safe. There were people out there, sometimes unseen, moving quietly, capable of making even the most peaceful place feel threatening. I realized that my craving for solitude had blinded me to the reality of being truly alone, vulnerable, with no one to help if something went wrong. I never forgot the sound of those footsteps, the way they circled the cabin, the quiet tension of each night spent in fear. But I also never forgot the relief of escaping, the first feeling of sunlight hitting my face as I reached the main road, the freedom that came with leaving the forest behind. Taught me caution, respect for isolation, and the value of human presence. And though I sometimes longed for the peace of the forest, I never sought it again in complete solitude. I understood now that some places, no matter how beautiful, are not meant to be experienced alone. I had been driving for hours before I finally turned off the main road and onto the narrow gravel path that led to the cabin. The sun had already started dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gray, and the air had begun to feel that sharp chill that always comes just before winter fully sets in. I had wanted to escape the city for a few days, to get away from the constant noise, the endless pressure of work, and the crowded streets. The cabin was small, tucked deep into the woods, surrounded by towering pines and oaks that had begun to shed their leaves in thick, rustling piles. I had booked it online, and the owner had said it was isolated but cozy, with a fireplace and all the essentials I would need. I wanted isolation, and I was about to get exactly that. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the path narrowed as it wound through the dense trees. There were no other cars, no houses, nothing but the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. By the time I arrived at the cabin, it was almost dark. I could barely make out its silhouette through the trees, but I could see that it was exactly what I had expected. Small, wooden, rustic, with a chimney poking out of the roof. The front door had a simple lock and a key I had picked up from a nearby store as instructed. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the cabin, the crunch of the gravel echoing in the quiet woods. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp pine. The walls were wooden planks, rough and sturdy, and the floor creaked slightly under my feet. There was a small kitchen area, a single bedroom, and a living space with a fireplace and a worn-out sofa. I set my bag down and took a moment to look around. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but it was peaceful in the way I had imagined. I lit a few candles, just for comfort, and started a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth began to chase away the chill that had settled into my bones during the drive. I decided to unpack a little to make the cabin feel more like my own. I laid out my clothes, my notebook, and my small supplies on the wooden table. The forest outside was dark now, the trees casting long shadows in the light of the fire and candles. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. At first, it was soothing, like the forest was alive but not threatening. I made myself a small dinner from the food I had brought. Some bread, cheese, and a tin of soup heated over the fire. The meal was simple but satisfying. As night fell deeper, I settled on the sofa with a blanket, letting the warmth from the fire seep into me. The isolation was beginning to sink in. There were no lights, no other houses, nothing but the dense woods around me. I knew it was safe. The cabin was sturdy, and the area was sparsely populated. Still, I felt an unusual tightness in my chest, a small prickle of anxiety. I told myself it was just being alone in the woods. Everyone who came here felt it, especially the first night. I read for a while, letting the soft glow of the fire illuminate the pages of my book. Around midnight, I realized that the wind had picked up outside. It pressed against the cabin walls with a low, constant thrum, and I could hear the branches scraping against the roof and windows. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal, that the forest was simply alive with the night. But then I heard a different sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from outside. At first, I thought it was a branch falling, or maybe an animal. The thumping continued, slow and deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. My heart started beating faster. I stood up and peered out the window. The darkness outside was absolute, the trees barely visible even with the light from the fire spilling out. I saw nothing, just the dark, swaying branches. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, maybe a raccoon. I had seen plenty of tracks on the way in. But the sound didn't stop. It continued in that steady, heavy rhythm. Then I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone or something was moving around outside, very close. I froze, listening. The sound of crunching gravel under boots, faint but unmistakable, made my stomach drop. I thought about my options. The cabin was locked, but the windows were thin. I could leave and try to run to the car, but it was dark, and the forest was thick. I could stay inside, barricade myself, and hope whoever was out there didn't try to force entry. I decided to stay. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the table and a kitchen knife, holding them tightly as I slowly moved toward the main door. The thumping stopped for a moment. Then it started again, louder and closer. I pressed myself against the wall near the door, listening. There was a faint scraping sound, like someone trying to test the lock. Panic began to rise in me, a cold, sharp panic. I told myself to breathe, to think. I needed to be ready. The fire was still burning, giving me some light and warmth, but it also cast shadows that made the darkness outside seem even deeper. I could hear footsteps moving around the side of the cabin. Whoever it was, they were circling. My mind raced through possibilities. Why would someone be here? The area was isolated, almost nobody came this far. Was it a thief? Someone looking for trouble? I didn't know. I decided to take action. I moved to the window that faced the path to the cabin, keeping low, holding the knife tightly. I shone the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam over the trees and the clearing in front of the cabin. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. My pulse quickened, but I stayed calm enough to assess. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly, deliberately, and staying in the cover of the forest. Hours seemed to pass like this. Every few minutes, I would see movement, hear a footstep, or catch the faint sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. I didn't sleep, didn't eat, just waited, tense and alert. The wind died down around 3 a.m., but the footsteps continued. Whoever it was, they were patient, methodical. I realized they were waiting for me to let my guard down. By early morning, the first light of day began to filter through the trees. I could see the clearing more clearly now, and with it, the tracks. Heavy footprints led to the cabin, circling it, and then disappearing back into the woods. Whoever had been there had left, at least for now. I stayed inside, exhausted, but I knew I couldn't just sit there forever. I needed to leave. I packed my bag quickly, throwing essentials together: food, water, my notebook, the flashlight, the knife. I checked the cabin one last time, making sure nothing had been disturbed. The front door was intact, the windows unbroken. Everything inside looked normal, almost untouched, but the tracks outside told a different story. Someone had been there, close enough to reach in if I hadn't been alert. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and looked around. The forest was quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the leaves. I followed the path back to the main road, staying alert, flashlight ready. The tracks disappeared as I moved further away, the forest swallowing them up. I drove slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees lining the road. The city lights in the distance felt surreal, almost like another world. When I finally got back to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and sat down heavily on the sofa. I felt exhausted, tense, but safe. The experience had been terrifying, and I knew I would never forget it. I never returned to that cabin. Later, I learned that other people had reported strange trespassers in the area, hunters, thieves, sometimes worse. It was a remote area, and law enforcement couldn't patrol it regularly. The isolation I had sought had almost cost me more than I bargained for. In the end, I realized that caution and awareness were my only real defenses. The cabin itself was harmless, the forest beautiful, but human threats were unpredictable. I learned to respect both the wilderness and the fact that even in the quietest, most remote places, people could pose real danger. I started taking more precautions, never traveling alone to isolated areas, always letting someone know where I was. The memory of that night stayed with me for years. The heavy thumping, the shadowy figures slipping through the trees, the feeling of being watched and alone. But it also taught me resilience. I survived by staying calm, staying alert, and trusting my instincts. That night, the forest had been threatening. The cabin had been my only refuge, and my own awareness had been my weapon. I never underestimated the power of vigilance again. Looking back, I can appreciate the raw beauty of the forest, the solitude I sought, and the adrenaline that surged through me in the darkness. I realized I didn't need ghosts or myths to make a night in the woods terrifying. Reality, human reality, was far scarier, and surviving it had given me a clarity I never expected. I never returned to that cabin, but I never forgot it either. It remained a stark reminder that isolation is not always peaceful, and safety is never guaranteed. But preparation, awareness, and calm thinking can make all the difference. I had been planning the trip for months, or at least it felt like months. I needed the time alone. Work had been unbearable, with deadlines piling up faster than I could keep track of, and the city noise seemed to follow me everywhere I went. The constant hum of traffic, the endless stream of people, the artificial lights that never truly went away. It all wore me down until I felt like I couldn't breathe properly anymore. I wanted silence, solitude, and a place that didn't have another human being within a mile of me. That's how I ended up booking a small cabin in a remote forest, far from the nearest town, deep in the mountains where the roads became dirt trails and cell service was patchy at best. The images online made it look peaceful, almost like a painting. A small wooden cabin surrounded by dense trees, with a clear stream running nearby and nothing else visible in any direction. It seemed perfect. I drove for hours, longer than I had expected, winding along narrow roads that became steeper and rougher the further I went. The forest grew denser, the trees taller, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead that blocked out most of the sun. Eventually, I turned off the main road onto a dirt trail that barely looked like a path. My car bounced and rattled over roots and rocks, but I kept going, repeating to myself that it would be worth it. The air smelled different out here, fresh, piney, almost sweet in a way I didn't recognize, and it made the long drive feel like it was leading somewhere alive. The closer I got, the quieter it became. No cars, no planes, no people. Just me, the wind, and the occasional bird call. Finally, I arrived. The cabin was exactly like the photos, maybe even smaller, more isolated than I imagined. It had a simple wooden porch, a couple of rocking chairs, and a small pile of firewood stacked neatly beside the door. I parked the car and took a deep breath, letting the quiet settle around me. For the first time in months, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. I unloaded my bags and brought in the essentials: food, water, a few blankets, my laptop, and some books. The cabin had basic furniture. A small table, a few chairs, a bed, a wood-burning stove, and shelves with some supplies left by the owner. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. The first day passed slowly, but peacefully. I unpacked, explored the nearby forest, and collected some firewood. I noticed the stream running a short distance from the cabin, its water clear and cold. I dipped my hand in and felt the chill, refreshing in the warm afternoon sun. I stayed near the water for a while, watching leaves float along the surface and listening to the soft trickle of water over rocks. When I returned, I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple dinner, and sat by the window watching the forest turn orange and gold as the sun set. It was perfect, almost unreal, and I fell asleep that night feeling more rested than I had in months. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows between the trees. I made some coffee and looked out the window, noticing how still everything was. There wasn't a sound except for the occasional bird and the distant babble of the stream. I spent the day exploring further, walking deeper into the forest than I had before. I kept a mental map of the area, noting a large rock formation that looked like a natural cliff, a patch of wildflowers growing near a clearing, and a fallen tree that had created a sort of natural bridge over a small ravine. Everything seemed fine, almost idyllic, but I couldn't shake a subtle feeling of unease, though I couldn't explain why. It wasn't fear exactly, just a sense that I was being watched, or that the forest was aware of me. I shook it off and continued walking, reminding myself that the forest was empty except for wildlife. That night, as darkness fell, I noticed the sounds of the forest changing. The wind picked up slightly, and the rustling of leaves became more pronounced. Every now and then, I heard a snapping sound, branches breaking, not from my own steps. My rational mind told me it was probably a deer or some other animal, maybe even a bear moving far off, but I still felt a prickle of anxiety. I kept the fire going, making sure the cabin felt warm and safe. I had packed a flashlight and some extra batteries, and I kept it close, just in case. The night was long. I tried to read, tried to listen to music, tried to distract myself, but the sounds outside, the constant rustling, the occasional heavy footstep that wasn't mine, made it impossible to relax completely. I eventually fell asleep with the fire dying down, hoping the night would pass quietly. The following day, I decided to explore more of the surrounding area. I packed some snacks, filled my water bottle, and followed a narrow trail I hadn't noticed before. It led me uphill and the climb was steep. My legs ached, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. When I finally reached the top, I found a small plateau overlooking a valley. The view was incredible. The forest stretched endlessly, the river winding like a silver ribbon far below. I sat there for a while, taking it in, feeling a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I marked the spot in my mind, thinking it would be the perfect place to return to each day for a sense of peace. I hiked back down, feeling tired but satisfied. As the sun began to set, I noticed the light dimming faster than expected. A storm had rolled in quietly. The sky turned gray, and clouds thickened. The wind picked up, and I felt the first drops of rain. I hurried back to the cabin, my clothes already damp. By the time I reached it, the rain was falling heavily, drumming on the roof in an almost deafening rhythm. I shut the windows tight, secured the door, and lit the stove, trying to make the cabin warm and dry. The storm raged all night, and I couldn't sleep well. Each gust of wind sounded like something heavy hitting the trees. Each crack of thunder made me tense. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving everything soaked and muddy. I had been driving for hours before I finally turned off the main road and onto the narrow gravel path that led to the cabin. The sun had already started dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gray, and the air had begun to feel that sharp chill that always comes just before winter fully sets in. I had wanted to escape the city for a few days, to get away from the constant noise, the endless pressure of work, and the crowded streets. The cabin was small, tucked deep into the woods, surrounded by towering pines and oaks that had begun to shed their leaves in thick, rustling piles. I had booked it online, and the owner had said it was isolated but cozy, with a fireplace and all the essentials I would need. I wanted isolation, and I was about to get exactly that. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the path narrowed as it wound through the dense trees. There were no other cars, no houses, nothing but the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. By the time I arrived at the cabin, it was almost dark. I could barely make out its silhouette through the trees, but I could see that it was exactly what I had expected. Small, wooden, rustic, with a chimney poking out of the roof. The front door had a simple lock and a key I had picked up from a nearby store as instructed. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the cabin, the crunch of the gravel echoing in the quiet woods. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp pine. The walls were wooden planks, rough and sturdy, and the floor creaked slightly under my feet. There was a small kitchen area, a single bedroom, and a living space with a fireplace and a worn-out sofa. I set my bag down and took a moment to look around. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but it was peaceful in the way I had imagined. I lit a few candles, just for comfort, and started a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth began to chase away the chill that had settled into my bones during the drive. I decided to unpack a little to make the cabin feel more like my own. I laid out my clothes, my notebook, and my small supplies on the wooden table. The forest outside was dark now, the trees casting long shadows in the light of the fire and candles. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. At first, it was soothing, like the forest was alive but not threatening. I made myself a small dinner from the food I had brought, some bread, cheese, and a tin of soup heated over the fire. The meal was simple but satisfying. As night fell deeper, I settled on the sofa with a blanket, letting the warmth from the fire seep into me. The isolation was beginning to sink in. There were no lights, no other houses, nothing but the dense woods around me. I knew it was safe. The cabin was sturdy, and the area was sparsely populated. Still, I felt an unusual tightness in my chest, a small prickle of anxiety. I told myself it was just being alone in the woods. Everyone who came here felt it, especially the first night. I read for a while, letting the soft glow of the fire illuminate the pages of my book. Around midnight, I realized that the wind had picked up outside. It pressed against the cabin walls with a low, constant thrum, and I could hear the branches scraping against the roof and windows. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal, that the forest was simply alive with the night. But then I heard a different sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from outside. At first, I thought it was a branch falling, or maybe an animal. The thumping continued, slow and deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. My heart started beating faster. I stood up and peered out the window. The darkness outside was absolute, the trees barely visible even with the light from the fire spilling out. I saw nothing, just the dark, swaying branches. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, maybe a raccoon. I had seen plenty of tracks on the way in. But the sound didn't stop. It continued in that steady, heavy rhythm. Then I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone or something was moving around outside, very close. I froze, listening. The sound of crunching gravel under boots, faint but unmistakable, made my stomach drop. I thought about my options. The cabin was locked, but the windows were thin. I could leave and try to run to the car, but it was dark, and the forest was thick. I could stay inside, barricade myself, and hope whoever was out there didn't try to force entry. I decided to stay. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the table and a kitchen knife, holding them tightly as I slowly moved toward the main door. The thumping stopped for a moment. Then it started again, louder and closer. I pressed myself against the wall near the door, listening. There was a faint scraping sound, like someone trying to test the lock. Panic began to rise in me, a cold, sharp panic. I told myself to breathe, to think. I needed to be ready. The fire was still burning, giving me some light and warmth, but it also cast shadows that made the darkness outside seem even deeper. I could hear footsteps moving around the side of the cabin. Whoever it was, they were circling. My mind raced through possibilities. Why would someone be here? The area was isolated, almost nobody came this far. Was it a thief? Someone looking for trouble? I didn't know. I had always liked the idea of being completely alone in the woods, away from the noise and the people, away from anything that could remind me of the world I had grown tired of. So, when I found the cabin online, tucked away in a forest several hours from the nearest town, I didn't think twice. It was old, wooden, with weathered logs and a steep roof, sitting beside a narrow river that ran through the forest. The pictures online made it look peaceful, quiet, almost like a place forgotten by time. I wanted that quiet. I wanted the isolation. I needed it. I drove through winding roads for hours, past small towns that seemed to exist only for people to pass through on their way to somewhere else. The trees grew taller the closer I got, and the roads narrowed into dirt and gravel. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already lowering behind the trees. The forest around me was dense and quiet. Birds were still calling, but even that sound felt distant. The cabin was as I expected, small and old, but solid. The logs had darkened with age, and the windows were streaked with rain and dust. A small porch ran along the front, and there was a rusted metal bucket by the side, probably for water, although I wasn't sure. I parked my car on a flattened patch of dirt that had probably once been a driveway, and I stepped out, taking a deep breath of the cold, damp air. It smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and something else I couldn't place. It was clean in a way untouched by anything human. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a small kitchen area with a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time, a small sink with a tap that might have worked, a wooden table, and 2 chairs. There was a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The floor creaked under my feet, and the air smelled faintly of mold and old wood. The walls were rough logs, with gaps filled by old cement or putty, and I could see the shadows of the forest pressed against the windows. There was a fireplace in the corner, cold and empty, and I noticed a stack of old newspapers piled beside it. I unpacked slowly, placing my bag on the bed and my supplies in the kitchen. I had brought a few cans of food, a small backpacking stove, and enough water for a few days. My phone had little to no signal, which was fine. I wanted to be alone. I wanted quiet. The first night was still. The forest was alive with small sounds, the scratching of branches, the occasional snap of a twig, and the hum of insects. But it was distant, not threatening, just reminders that the world continued outside. I lit a candle I had brought and sat at the table, eating a simple meal. Outside, the sky had turned dark, and the moon cast long shadows across the porch and the yard. The river whispered somewhere behind the trees, and I could hear it if I pressed my ears to the window. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I dozed, I was aware of the dark pressing against the windows, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. I told myself it was just nerves, the strangeness of being alone. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The forest was dense, and the river ran along one side of the cabin, curving around before disappearing behind a cluster of trees. I walked carefully along the bank, noting the tracks of animals. Deer, raccoons, something larger that I couldn't identify. The ground was soft and muddy from recent rains, and the air smelled sharp and wet. The isolation felt peaceful at first, but then I realized how easily someone or something could approach the cabin without being seen. The thought made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. I had done this before in other forests, had hiked alone in the mountains. I knew the risks. By evening, I was exhausted. I had walked further than I thought, and my legs ached from navigating fallen logs, tangled roots, and slippery mud. I lit the candle again and cooked a small meal. The sun went down faster than I had expected, and the forest became darker than I was comfortable with. The shadows seemed deeper, the sounds sharper. I kept the door locked and checked the windows, making sure the latches were secure. I didn't hear anything unusual, but my heart kept racing. Night fell, and with it came a silence that was different from the first night. This wasn't the quiet of nature going about its business. This was heavy, tense, almost expectant. I tried to read to calm myself, but my eyes kept wandering to the windows. I kept imagining shadows moving just beyond the glass, leaves brushing against the cabin as if someone or something was circling. I forced myself to relax, telling myself that the wind and the animals made all these sounds. I had to believe that. Around midnight, I woke to a soft noise. It was faint at first, just a tapping, like someone knocking on wood from the outside. I froze, listening. The sound repeated, irregular, closer this time. I stayed very still, straining to hear. It stopped. I waited, my heart hammering. Then I heard it again on the opposite side of the cabin, near the back where the woods pressed up against the walls. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind ran through the possibilities. Animal, wind, branches falling. But the sound didn't fit any of those. It was deliberate, too precise to be natural. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and angry. I considered leaving immediately, packing up and driving back to civilization. But the road was long and winding, and I didn't have the energy to confront it at that moment. I decided instead to be cautious, to watch the cabin carefully, and wait until nightfall when I could plan a safe exit. I spent the day moving quietly around the cabin, checking windows and doors, making sure nothing had been tampered with. The footprints were the only evidence of the intruder. Nothing else was missing or broken. I reinforced the doors and windows as best I could, placing rocks and furniture against entry points. I ate very little, drank water carefully, and stayed alert. The sun moved slowly, shadows shifting across the ground, but I never left the cabin itself. When night fell again, I stayed awake, waiting. Hours passed, the forest around me alive with nocturnal sounds, but no one came close. I realized then that whoever had been here might have been watching me, testing the place, seeing if I was alone. The realization made my stomach turn. I had been lucky. I had survived the first night, but I knew it could happen again. The second night was long, the darkness heavier than the first. Every noise made me jump. I stayed near the knife, near the door, ready to defend myself. Hours passed. The fear settled into a dull ache, a constant presence at the edge of my awareness. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I counted every hour, every minute, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, I made my plan. I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly but carefully, keeping my movements slow and deliberate so as not to make noise. I took the knife with me, my bag slung over my shoulder, and I prepared to leave. I stepped outside, scanning the trees, looking for signs of anyone lurking. The forest was quiet, ordinary, as if nothing had happened. I walked carefully back down the dirt road, every step deliberate, my eyes constantly on the tree line. I didn't hear anything behind me. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. After what felt like hours, the trees thinned, and I saw the edge of the main road. A car passed by, headlights cutting through the morning mist. I flagged it down, and the driver stopped without hesitation. I told him I needed help, that I was alone and had been staying in a cabin in the woods. He listened without judgment, radioed for assistance, and I was able to get back to a small town where I could call the police. The officers took me seriously. They went to the cabin and found signs of someone having been there. Footprints, disturbed soil, slight damage to the outer door frame, but no one was found. They warned me that remote cabins are often targeted by people who watch for lone occupants. I realized how close I had been to something far worse. I had survived because I stayed alert, because I trusted my instincts, and because I left at the first sign of danger. Even weeks later, I could still feel the fear of that night, the sense of being watched, the realization of how small I was in a place that seemed so peaceful at first glance. The cabin had been a trap of my own making, a false sanctuary that could have cost me dearly. I never went back. I never forgot the feeling of being alone in the dark, with someone unseen observing every move. The woods stayed beautiful in my memory, but they were no longer safe. I had learned the hard way that isolation in the wilderness is not just about being alone with nature. It's about being alone with the potential for danger, human or otherwise, that can appear without warning. I don't tell many people about what happened, because it's not a story of heroism or luck. It's a story of survival, of paying attention, of understanding how fragile safety can be when you are truly alone. I've kept a notebook since then, recording everything I remember, because the mind exaggerates and shifts memories under stress. Writing it down keeps it real. I've grown more cautious, more aware of the world outside civilization, but I also learned something important. Fear is not weakness. It is a tool, a signal, a guide. The cabin may have been a nightmare, but it taught me how to survive, how to listen, how to trust my instincts when no one else can. I eventually found other cabins to visit, safer ones, with neighbors not too far away, cell service and security. I never forgot that first one, though. Every time I drive into the forest now, I remember the darkness, the silence, and the footprints in the mud. I know what it feels like to be truly vulnerable. I also know that preparation, attention, and decisive action can save a life. That cabin, that night, changed the way I move through the world. I carry it with me, a constant reminder that danger is often quiet, patient, and unseen. But it can be survived if you respect it, if you never let your guard down, and if you never underestimate the power of being alone in the right or wrong place. I had been planning this solo trip for months, waiting for the right weekend when work would let me slip away and the weather forecast promised cold, clear nights with no rain. I needed a break, a chance to get away from the endless noise of the city, from the constant emails, the phone calls, the lights that never turned off. I wanted quiet, isolation, and the kind of solitude that let you feel your own heartbeat in the cold. That was why I rented the small cabin in the middle of the mountains, a place accessible only by a narrow, rough gravel road that disappeared into dense pine forests on both sides. The GPS promised I would find it, but only if I was patient and careful. The drive was longer than I expected. The last 10 miles were a crawl, each bend in the road hiding another dense cluster of trees, the gravel crunching under my tires. The sun was dipping behind the peaks, throwing long shadows across the road and turning the sky a dull orange that made everything feel sharper, more tense. When I finally saw the cabin, I realized it was smaller than the pictures had suggested, almost swallowed by the forest. Its walls were dark wood, weathered and rough, with small windows that reflected the dying light. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the air like a lazy warning. The cabin was quiet when I stepped inside. The door squeaked, a sound that made me flinch more than it should have. Inside, it smelled of wood polish and a faint mustiness, like the air had been trapped for years. The interior was simple. A small kitchen with a stove that looked older than I was, a single bed in the corner, a worn armchair, and a table with a few chairs around it. There was a woodpile stacked neatly by the wall and a fireplace with soot darkening its bricks. I set down my bag and ran my hands over the rough surfaces, feeling the grains of the wood, the slight unevenness of the floorboards. I spent the first hour unpacking and organizing, making the cabin feel a little more like mine. I stacked firewood near the fireplace, checked the stove for matches, and made sure the windows and doors were securely shut. There was no cell signal, which was exactly what I wanted, but that also meant that once I was here, I was completely cut off. That knowledge made my skin prickle, a nervous, restless feeling crawling up my spine. Night fell faster than I expected. The sky turned dark blue, almost black, and the first stars appeared, tiny pinpricks of light scattered over the darkness. I lit the fireplace, the flames crackling and throwing shadows across the walls. I sat in the armchair, a blanket around my shoulders, and listened. First, it was peaceful. I could hear the wind rustling the trees outside, the occasional snap of a branch, the far-off call of an owl. But then I started noticing other sounds, smaller, subtler ones. A soft scrape against the side of the cabin, a thump on the roof, a rustle in the underbrush. My heartbeat quickened. First, I tried to rationalize everything. Animals, I told myself, a raccoon or a deer. The cabin settling, old wood contracting and expanding in the cold night. But the noises persisted, and they started to feel deliberate, like something or someone was moving around outside, watching. My eyes darted to the windows, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I thought about going outside, but the forest felt like it would swallow me whole. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and I realized I hadn't checked the locks. I went from window to window, securing them, checking the doors, pushing the bolts tighter than they probably needed to be. Sleep was impossible. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not soft, careful footsteps, but heavy ones, deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. My stomach dropped. I froze, holding my breath, listening. They paused at the front door, the sound of weight shifting on the gravel. I could hear the faint scrape of metal, as if someone was testing the lock. I stayed awake for hours, listening. The tapping came and went, sometimes soft, sometimes heavier, like footsteps. I considered leaving, but the nearest road was miles away, and it was dark. I had no flashlight, only the weak candlelight, and the thought of walking into the forest alone at that hour made my stomach twist. I stayed in the bed, eyes wide, listening to every creak and rustle. By morning, the sun's first light was a relief, and I realized I hadn't slept. The next day, I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were no signs of anyone being there. No footprints, no disturbed brush, no discarded items. The only tracks were animal tracks in the mud. I felt a little foolish, but the unease didn't go away. That night, I set up a makeshift barricade, pushing chairs against the doors and windows, and I kept a kitchen knife close. The tapping returned around midnight, more persistent this time. I didn't move, didn't react, just waited. It faded after a while, and the forest went silent again. The following days were a mix of fear and careful observation. I explored the forest further during the day, noting the way the trees and river twisted, memorizing the landscape so I could navigate it in the dark if I had to. I reinforced the cabin as best I could, fixing weak locks, securing windows, stacking firewood against doors. I kept a constant watch at night, and though the sounds never became violent or aggressive, the tapping and occasional rustling continued. It was always there, subtle, a reminder that I was not entirely alone. On the fifth day, I noticed something strange. A section of the ground near the back of the cabin had been disturbed. Small holes, footprints pressed into the mud, almost hidden under fallen leaves. The footprints were human-sized, and they weren't there before. My stomach dropped. I checked again and again, but no one was visible in the woods. I realized then that whoever or whatever had been making the noises was real, and they were watching, waiting. My earlier assumptions about animals or wind were gone. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin much longer without taking action. I began planning an exit strategy. I packed supplies quietly, keeping a low profile. During the day, I moved carefully, always scanning the treeline, noting the shadows, the brush, the way the light fell on the forest floor. I tried to remain calm, but the fear was constant. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help unless I got to the road. I had to time it perfectly. On the seventh day, I woke before dawn. The forest was still, and the first light was gray and muted. I packed the last of my things, strapped on my backpack, and prepared to leave. I moved quietly, sticking close to the trees, avoiding open ground. I took a long, indirect route to the road, circling around the back of the cabin and moving along the river where I could keep the forest between me and the cabin. I didn't look back, didn't pause. It took hours to reach the road. By the time I emerged onto the gravel path, the sun was rising, casting light across the forest. I walked quickly, then broke into a run when I saw a car approaching. I stuck out my thumb and got a lift to the nearest town. I didn't look back, even when the driver offered a friendly smile and asked where I had been. I just sat, exhausted, tense, and aware that someone had been out there, watching me. I reported the disturbance to the authorities, describing the tracks and the noises. They came out to check the cabin, and while they didn't find anyone at the time, the signs were there. The footprints, the disturbed earth, the signs of someone having been inside the forest without leaving clear paths. They suggested it might have been a transient person, someone living off the forest, but I didn't care about the explanations. I just knew that the fear I had felt was real, grounded in something human, something calculating. After that, I stayed in town for a few days, sleeping in a proper bed, eating in restaurants, avoiding the forest entirely. The memory of the cabin, the tapping at night, the hidden presence in the woods, stayed with me. I realized then that the fear wasn't just the isolation. It was the knowledge that someone could be out there, unseen, waiting. That was worse than any ghost or fantasy. That was real. Over time, I returned to my life, but I never went back to the woods. I didn't hike alone anymore, didn't seek isolation in the wild. But I did something important. I stayed alert, aware of my surroundings, and I learned that even in places that seem safe, the world can be unpredictable. The cabin had shown me that. The fear I had felt there had been justified, and I had survived it. I carried the lessons with me, and though I never returned, I never forgot. The forest, the cabin, the tapping at night. It stayed in my mind, a reminder that reality could be far scarier than anything imagined. And in the end, I realized that surviving wasn't just about getting out. It was about paying attention, preparing, and respecting the unknown that existed in the real world. The cabin had been a trial, a test of awareness and endurance, and I had passed it. I had left, unscathed but changed, stronger, warier, and alive in a way I had never been before. I had planned the trip for months. The idea was simple: a weekend alone in the woods to escape everything, to disconnect from the constant noise of the city, from work emails, phone calls, the endless hum of people's expectations. I wanted silence, solitude, and a place where I could think. I didn't imagine that the woods could feel alive in a way that made me small, that made me question every sound and shadow. I drove for hours, the city shrinking behind me, the buildings giving way to fields, then forests. I had a cabin booked through an online listing. It was described as remote, surrounded by thick woods, accessible only by a rough dirt road. I had no cell signal at the time, and I liked that. The cabin was exactly as pictured, maybe even more secluded than I expected. It was small, made of dark wood, with a single window on each wall. The front door creaked on its hinges, and the air inside smelled of pine, dust, and something faintly metallic. There was a small fireplace, a bed with a simple mattress, a table, and a few shelves with old, dusty books. I spent the first few hours unpacking my things, organizing my food, water, and supplies. I had a small gas stove, a lantern, a first aid kit, and enough blankets to keep warm. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and a few birds called occasionally. I felt calm. I thought I was prepared. I thought I was safe. Night came quickly. Without streetlights, the darkness was absolute. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and I lit the lantern. Shadows moved across the walls, the furniture casting shapes that seemed larger than they were. I told myself it was normal, that my mind was adjusting to the quiet, that it was just a trick of light and shadow. I had eaten dinner, cleaned the small kitchen area, and settled on the bed with a book, trying to lose myself in the story. Then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. A snap like a branch breaking under weight, followed by a soft, slow shuffle. I froze. My heart started beating faster. The wind outside had calmed, and the forest was still. That meant the sound was close, inside the woods, near the cabin. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound came again, closer this time, deliberate. I could hear footsteps now, careful, slow. I got up and moved to the window. I tried to look outside, but the darkness swallowed everything. My eyes strained. My breathing grew heavy. There was nothing, only the faint outlines of trees swaying in the wind. I stepped back from the window and told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a wild animal. Maybe my imagination. I tried to sleep. I really tried, but every noise became terrifying. The wind hitting the trees sounded like someone moving through the branches. The creaking of the cabin floor sounded like someone walking across the room. Every time the lantern flickered, I felt a shadow pass over the wall. I kept telling myself it was normal, that the woods were alive with sounds at night. I tried to focus on my breathing, to calm down, but the fear was creeping in, crawling into my chest, tightening like a vice. Around midnight, I woke to a louder sound, something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. Not once, but 3 quick, hard thuds. My body froze. I couldn't move. I wanted to believe it was a branch falling, but it was different, more precise, more forceful. I could feel my chest pounding, my palms sweating. I reached for the small kitchen knife I had packed, gripping it tightly. The sounds continued sporadically, sometimes a thud on the wall, sometimes on the roof, sometimes a soft scrape near the door. I stayed as still as possible, listening, trying to figure out what was happening. The logical part of me whispered that it could be a bear or a large animal, maybe a raccoon trying to get inside. But a bigger, darker thought formed. What if it wasn't an animal? What if someone had followed me here? Someone who knew I would be alone. I had made no effort to hide my location. The cabin listing was public, and anyone could have booked the place before me. Anyone could have found the dirt road leading to it. I tried to convince myself that it was unlikely, that the chances of someone being here were slim, but the fear was rationalizing everything. Every sound became evidence, every shadow a possible intruder. I waited until the first hint of light outside, listening. The sounds had stopped, replaced by the ordinary noises of the forest waking up. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant sound of running water. I thought I was safe for the moment, but I knew I couldn't stay inside like this. I needed to check the perimeter to make sure nothing had been disturbed overnight. I opened the door carefully, knife in hand, and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp. The ground was soft, littered with fallen leaves and pine needles. I scanned the area, looking for tracks, signs of entry, anything unusual. That's when I saw them, footprints in the mud. They were large, heavy, human-shaped, leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin, stopping just short of the door, and then heading back into the trees. They were fresh, the mud still soft and wet. My heart sank. Someone had been here last night. Someone had watched me sleep. I realized I had to act, even though my mind screamed to stay still. I grabbed the largest flashlight I had brought, checked the kitchen for anything that could serve as a weapon, and moved to the window that faced the front. The light from my flashlight swept across the gravel driveway, the dark outlines of trees, and then I saw them. A man, tall, wearing a hooded jacket that swallowed his face in shadow. He was standing still now, staring at the cabin. He didn't move like a person who was lost. He moved like someone who knew exactly where he was going. My throat went dry. I considered my options. I could stay inside, hope he went away, or I could try to get to my car and leave. But the driveway was uneven and long, and the forest on either side was thick and unwelcoming. I knew that if I tried to run, he could be waiting for me. My only real chance was to barricade myself inside and hope for the best. I grabbed heavy furniture, wedging chairs and the small table against the door, blocking every possible entry point. The cabin groaned under the strain, but it held. Hours passed like this, my flashlight flicking on and off, my eyes straining in the darkness. The man stayed outside, pacing slowly, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving in a deliberate circle around the cabin. I could hear the crunch of gravel under his boots, the scrape of a branch against his jacket, the faint hiss of breath. Every time the wind blew, I thought he was moving closer. Every shadow on the wall made me flinch. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear. I could no longer keep my body tense, and I sank into the armchair, trying to stay awake, my hand on the fireplace poker just in case. Morning came slowly, the pale light of dawn creeping through the windows. When I finally dared to look outside, the man was gone. The gravel driveway was empty, the forest still. I checked every corner, but there was no sign of him. I realized I had survived the night. I didn't know who he was, or why he had come to the cabin. I left immediately, driving back down the winding road, my eyes constantly scanning the trees. I reported the incident to the local authorities later that day. They said there had been break-ins in the area, campers and cabin renters targeted for their isolation, but no one had been caught yet. The experience stayed with me for weeks, a shadow in the back of my mind every time I heard a creak or a footstep. I returned to the city with a new appreciation for security, for the safety of other people around me. I realized that isolation could be dangerous, and even the smallest sounds in the dark could make the mind invent scenarios far worse than reality. I never went back to the cabin. I kept it in my memory, a reminder of the thin line between solitude and vulnerability. The fear I felt was real, and it had taught me to respect the unpredictability of people, the dangers of the wilderness, and the importance of being prepared for the unexpected. I had planned the cabin trip for months, thinking it would be the perfect escape from the stress of work and the constant noise of the city. I wanted silence, isolation, a chance to think clearly and breathe in fresh air without any interruptions. The cabin I found was deep in the mountains, reachable only by a long dirt road that twisted and turned through thick forest. I packed my car carefully, making sure I had enough supplies for a week. Food, water, firewood, basic tools, and a first aid kit. I didn't tell anyone I was going, because I liked the idea of being completely alone. That solitude was part of the appeal, but I didn't realize how fragile a sense of safety can be when the world shrinks to the space of a single cabin in the woods. The drive was long, the kind that makes your shoulders ache from holding the steering wheel too tightly and your eyes sting from staring at the road through the thin morning light. The forest seemed endless, the trees dense and dark, the branches hanging low over the road in some places. The air smelled of wet leaves and soil, and there was a strange hush over everything, a quiet that felt unnatural even in nature. Occasionally, I saw deer darting through the trees or heard the distant cry of a hawk, but otherwise it was completely silent. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the mountains, leaving the sky streaked with pink and orange. The cabin was older than I expected, a wooden structure with a steep roof and a small porch. The wood was weathered, rough, and darkened by years of sun and rain. The windows were small and grimy, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of old wood mixed with dust and mildew hit me immediately, but it didn't feel unpleasant, just lived in. The cabin was simple: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a sink and cupboards, and a narrow staircase leading up to a loft where I would sleep. There were signs of previous occupants, but it was mostly empty, giving me the sense of space I had hoped for. I spent the first hour unpacking and setting up. I stacked firewood neatly near the fireplace, checked the stove to make sure it worked, and placed my supplies in the small kitchen. The sun had fully disappeared behind the mountains by the time I finished, leaving the cabin in deep twilight. I lit the fireplace, the flames snapping and crackling, sending warm orange light bouncing across the wooden walls. I had dinner, a simple meal I had brought in a cooler, and sat by the fire, enjoying the sound of it and the quiet around me. Felt perfect. Solitude was peaceful, even comforting. I went to bed early, tired from the long drive and the work of unpacking. The first night was uneventful. I slept with the window cracked slightly, the cool mountain air drifting in. I woke occasionally to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, a branch falling somewhere outside, maybe an animal moving through the brush. It was distant, unobtrusive, nothing that set off alarms. I felt safe. The next morning, I woke early, eager to explore. I prepared a quick breakfast and set out along a trail I had noticed near the cabin. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick, but the path was clear enough to follow. The air was crisp and smelled of pine. I walked for hours, taking in the sunlight filtering through the trees, the way the shadows stretched and shifted with the morning sun. I came across a small stream, its water clear and cold, and stopped to drink and rest. The isolation was intoxicating. For a moment, I thought about how easy it would be to disappear entirely, to leave behind the noise and the responsibilities of the world. But that thought was fleeting. I had my supplies, my car, and the awareness that I could always return to civilization. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin to find a few strange things. The door had been latched, but the latch looked slightly off, as if it had been forced. My first thought was that I hadn't closed it properly, but then I noticed the firewood stack had been slightly disturbed. Some logs shifted from their neat arrangement. I chalked it up to animals. Perhaps a raccoon or a deer had gotten close. The thought made me uneasy but not alarmed. I made sure the door was firmly closed and the windows locked, then sat by the fire with a book, trying to shake off the feeling of eyes watching me. The feeling didn't leave, though. It lingered in the corners of my mind, a subtle tension that I tried to ignore. The next day, things escalated in small but unsettling ways. I had gone out to collect more firewood from the surrounding forest when I noticed something odd. On the ground near a cluster of trees, there were fresh footprints. Human footprints. They were boot prints, large and deep, pressed into the soil as if someone heavy had walked there recently. My heart jumped. I looked around, the forest otherwise empty. I could see no one. I followed the trail for a short distance, but it ended abruptly. That was when I realized the footprints were new. They hadn't been there the day before, and they led from the direction of the cabin out into the woods. My stomach sank. Someone had been close to the cabin while I was inside. I returned immediately, scanning the trees for movement, and kept the axe I had brought with me close at hand. I spent the afternoon checking the cabin thoroughly. Windows, doors, cupboards, even the loft where I slept. I inspected everything to ensure nothing was disturbed. Everything seemed in place, but the feeling didn't leave. I kept hearing noises in the forest. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Sometimes when I was certain I was alone. At night, the sounds grew louder. I would lie awake in the loft, the shadows from the fire flickering on the walls, and hear distant footsteps crunching on the ground outside. I thought about calling someone, but my phone had no signal in that area. The nearest town was miles away. I was completely isolated. By the third night, I realized I wasn't just uneasy. I was being watched. The feeling was undeniable. The noises outside had become deliberate, precise. Footsteps pacing near the cabin. A branch tapping against a window at exactly the same spot I had left it. The sense that something or someone was circling the cabin, waiting. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fireplace all night, axe in hand, listening, counting each sound, each step. I could hear breathing outside, faint but distinct. Whoever it was knew I was alone, and they were testing me, pushing the boundaries. I spent the next day preparing. I reinforced the doors with heavy logs from the firewood stack, moved furniture to block the windows, and made sure every point of entry was secure. I considered leaving, but the road back to civilization was long, and the dirt path was isolated. If someone was out there, they could intercept me. I had to wait until morning when visibility would be better. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself of logic and reason, but the tension was overwhelming. Every small noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed like a person. Night fell again, darker than before, with clouds covering the moon. The wind picked up, and the forest seemed alive with movement. I could hear someone moving deliberately around the cabin, footsteps circling, scraping against the wood. At one point, I heard the door handle jiggle. My heart nearly stopped. I gripped the axe, waited, and the handle stopped moving. I stayed in the loft, holding my breath, listening as the sounds eventually faded into the night. I stayed awake until dawn, the forest quieting as the first light crept through the trees. The next morning, I left the cabin for the first time since the situation escalated. I walked cautiously along the trail, keeping my eyes on the surroundings, and noticed broken branches, footprints, and disturbed undergrowth. It was clear someone had been following me. My mind raced, considering all possibilities. A thief, a local who knew the area, someone looking for easy prey. I kept moving, leaving markers and trying to memorize the terrain in case I needed to escape. I knew I had to get out, but I had to be smart about it. Panic could get me killed. By mid-afternoon, I had made a plan. I would pack what I could carry quickly, leaving unnecessary items behind to move faster. I moved silently, scanning constantly, waiting for any sign of movement. I reached the car and began loading the essentials. Then I saw it. A figure in the trees, partially hidden, watching me. I froze. They didn't move aggressively, but the presence was enough. My adrenaline spiked. I had to act quickly. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove off carefully, keeping my eyes on the trees. The figure did not pursue, at least not visibly, but the sense of being followed remained as I descended the dirt road. The drive back to civilization was tense. Every curve of the road seemed dangerous, every shadow in the forest a potential threat. I focused on the road, kept moving, and eventually reached the highway, where the isolation of the mountains was replaced by the familiar presence of cars and people. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that someone had been near me, inside my sanctuary, and I had no idea why or who they were. I called the authorities and reported the situation, but with no physical evidence beyond the footprints and minor disturbances. There was little they could do. Still, the record was made. In the days after, I recovered physically, but the mental strain lingered. I couldn't shake the memory of being watched, the nights spent listening to footsteps circling my cabin, the fear of someone breaching my space. I realized the vulnerability of isolation, the fragility of safety when you are truly alone. I never returned to that cabin. Eventually, I sold it, cutting all ties to the place. I kept the experience close in my mind, a reminder of how quickly solitude can turn from peaceful to terrifying, and how important it is to respect the unknown elements of isolation. I learned to plan better, to stay aware, to never underestimate how real danger can be, even in what seems like the quietest, safest place. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and I developed a deep respect for the quiet spaces I once craved. The forest that had seemed so inviting now held a subtle threat in my mind, a memory of footsteps and rustling leaves that could mean someone else, always watching, always waiting. I never let myself forget it, because it taught me something crucial. Safety is never guaranteed, and solitude can be both a gift and a trap. And in that trap, I had learned the most vivid lesson of my life. Vigilance and preparation are the only shields against the unknown. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. The city was loud, messy, and full of people who seemed to have no respect for each other. I liked quiet. I liked being able to hear the wind in the trees, the distant cry of birds, and the soft hum of insects at night. I found a small cabin online that was up for rent for a week. It wasn't expensive, which surprised me at first, because it looked sturdy in the photos and sat deep in the forest, surrounded by dense pine trees and a small river a short walk away. The pictures showed a simple wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a small porch, and windows that reflected the forest like mirrors. The idea of being completely isolated excited me more than it scared me. I booked it immediately, ignoring the tiny voice in my head that warned me to check reviews more carefully. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already low behind the horizon. The gravel road leading to the cabin had long stretches of overgrown grass and small potholes, and I had to drive slowly to avoid scraping the undercarriage. When I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, it was almost perfectly silent. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, fresh but heavy in a way that city air never was. I parked my car near the cabin and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The wooden boards of the porch creaked under my weight, and I felt a slight chill despite the warm day. The cabin was old, and the wood was weathered, but it seemed solid. The lock clicked easily as I opened the door, and the smell of dust mixed with wood polish greeted me. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A single room served as the living area and kitchen, with a small wood-burning stove in one corner, a fridge, a sink, and a narrow table. A ladder led up to a loft where a mattress lay waiting. I set my bag down and started exploring. The windows looked out over the trees, some leaning toward the cabin as if trying to peek inside. I made a mental note that I would have to trim some branches later, just to stop the constant scratching sound when the wind blew. I unpacked my things slowly, making the place feel like my own, even if only for a week. The first night was peaceful. I lit the stove and boiled some water for tea, then sat in a chair by the window, watching as the last light faded from the sky. The forest became darker with each passing hour, the shadows stretching long across the clearing. I had brought a flashlight and extra batteries, just in case, and the sound of its low hum when I turned it on felt reassuring. Around midnight, I heard something I wasn't expecting. A snapping sound outside, like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze. My heart picked up speed, but I tried to rationalize it. Animals. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I peered through the window, shining my flashlight toward the noise, but I couldn't see anything. The forest swallowed the beam almost immediately. I went back to my chair, telling myself I was overreacting. The next morning, I decided to go for a short walk along the path leading to the river. The sunlight filtered through the tall trees, creating long stripes on the forest floor. Birds were chirping, and for a moment, the world seemed perfect. But as I walked further, I noticed something strange. Small footprints in the mud. At first, I thought they might be from an animal, but the shape didn't match anything I had seen before. They looked almost human. I stopped and stared. The footprints led from the woods toward my cabin. My stomach sank. I tried to convince myself it was someone else staying nearby, maybe another hiker, but the area was supposed to be remote. I hurried back to the cabin and locked the door, checking the windows carefully. Nothing seemed out of place inside. I stayed alert the rest of the day, keeping the lights on and checking the perimeter as much as possible. Every little sound made me tense. The creak of the floorboards, the wind in the branches, the distant howl of a coyote. I started to realize that being alone in the forest was not as peaceful as I had imagined. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound felt amplified. I kept imagining shapes moving outside, watching me. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. A soft crunching, like footsteps on the gravel outside. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped near the porch. I could swear I saw a shadow through the window. My mind raced. I wanted to run, but my car was parked far away, and the woods made it impossible to see what was happening. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly moved toward the door, shining the beam outside. Nothing. The forest looked empty, silent except for the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I discovered something unsettling. The footprints I had seen before were back, but closer this time. They were larger, deeper, and led around the cabin in a complete circle. I examined them carefully. They looked fresh, as if someone had walked around the cabin during the night. My heart pounded. I realized I had to be more careful. I reinforced the locks on the doors and windows and kept a long metal rod near the bed. Every little sound made me tense, and I avoided going outside except when necessary. Over the next few days, the sense of being watched grew stronger. I would catch glimpses of movement through the trees, shadows shifting even when the wind wasn't blowing. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that the forest was full of animals, but something didn't feel right. One evening, I decided to set up a small camera outside, hidden in the trees, just to see if anything was there during the night. I had no experience with surveillance equipment, but I managed to get it working. I hid it near the edge of the clearing, pointing toward the porch. The night passed slowly. I barely slept, listening to every creak and crack. When morning came, I checked the camera footage. My stomach turned. There was someone outside. A man. I could see him clearly, moving around the cabin, looking through the windows. He wasn't wearing anything unusual, just normal clothes, but the way he moved made my blood run cold. He didn't leave footprints beyond the circle he walked in, as if he knew exactly where to step to avoid leaving traces. My heart raced, and I realized I had to take serious action. I called the local ranger station. The line was weak, and I had to hold the phone in a specific spot near the window to get a signal, but eventually, I got through. I explained the situation, and they promised to send someone to check the area. They warned me not to leave the cabin until help arrived and to stay alert. I spent the rest of the day barricading the doors as best as I could, stacking furniture against them and covering windows with blankets. Every sound made me jump, but I forced myself to stay quiet and watchful. That night, the man returned. I saw him through the camera, standing just at the edge of the clearing, staring at the cabin. He didn't move for hours. I couldn't see his face clearly, just his shape, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze even from the camera feed. I kept the flashlight trained on him just to have some measure of control. At dawn, he disappeared into the forest. I called the rangers again, who told me they were on their way. The next day, a ranger arrived. I led him around the cabin, showing him the footprints and the camera. He listened carefully and said it sounded like someone had been stalking me for several days, but they hadn't left many clues. They would patrol the area and keep an eye out. I stayed in the cabin, tense but slightly relieved that I wasn't alone. The sense of safety, however temporary, helped me sleep a little that night. In the following days, I stayed mostly inside, only venturing out during daylight to gather water and food from my supplies. The rangers checked in periodically, and I finally started to relax when no further signs of the man appeared. I realized how close I had come to real danger, how vulnerable I was in such isolation. It wasn't like a story in a book. It was raw, real fear. I had underestimated how careful someone with bad intentions could be. By the end of the week, I was ready to leave. I packed my things slowly, making sure nothing was left behind. As I drove away from the cabin, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadow following me down the gravel road. But the forest remained silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, and I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I had survived, but I knew I would never forget the fear of those nights. The knowledge that someone had been outside, watching me, knowing I was completely alone. Looking back, I realized what I had learned. Isolation in the woods is beautiful, but it is also dangerous. Nature doesn't care about fear, and people with ill intent are not bound by morality. My time in that cabin taught me respect for the wilderness and for the unknown dangers it can hold. I never returned to that cabin, and I never stayed in a remote cabin alone again. But I also carried with me a sense of accomplishment. I had survived, fully aware, fully alert, and fully in control of my own actions when faced with real fear. The experience was terrifying, yes, but it had a clear ending. I left alive, unharmed, and wiser than I had been when I arrived. The cabin, the forest, and the fear would remain a memory, vivid and clear, for the rest of my life. I never thought a quiet weekend in the mountains could turn into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I had driven up on a Thursday morning, the roads empty except for the occasional delivery truck or distant car. The sun was bright, the air sharp and clean, carrying the smell of pine needles and wet soil from the early morning dew. My plan was simple: spend a few days alone at a small rental cabin deep in the forest, hike the trails, maybe read a few books, and mostly just escape from the constant hum of the city. I had imagined it all. Calm mornings with sunlight spilling across the wooden floors, the sound of birds singing, the wind rustling through the trees. I wanted quiet. What I got was something I would never forget. The cabin itself was about 20 minutes down a narrow gravel road, surrounded by dense forest. When I arrived, the gravel crunched sharply under my tires, and I realized how far I was from anything resembling civilization. The cabin looked unassuming from the outside, weathered, made of rough wood, with a steep roof and a small porch. There were no neighbors in sight, no smoke from chimneys, nothing but the forest pressing in on all sides. The air smelled like moss and old wood. I parked, grabbed my bags, and unlocked the door. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood polish and the lingering scent of whatever the previous renter had left behind. Dust covered the edges of the furniture, and the faint creak of the floorboards under my weight made the place feel alive in a subtle, uneasy way. I spent the afternoon unpacking and organizing. I lit the fireplace, even though it wasn't cold, because I wanted that feeling of warmth and security. The cabin had a small kitchen, a bedroom with a bed, a bathroom, and a tiny loft with a chair and a stack of old books. The windows were thick and slightly fogged from age, but they looked out over dense trees and the faint outline of distant hills. I decided to hike the nearby trail before sunset. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, a flashlight, and a pocket knife, just in case. The trail was beautiful at first. The sun slanted low through the branches, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The smell of pine and damp earth was sharp and clear. Birds called occasionally, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush made me feel connected to the wilderness. I didn't realize how quickly the trail became less maintained. Branches overhung the path, and roots jutted up, making each step careful. I was alone, and that alone was calming at first, but then something shifted. I noticed footprints in the dirt, fresh, human-sized, heading in the same direction I was going. I felt a little nervous but tried to shake it off. The forest was full of hikers, and maybe someone had passed through earlier in the day. But as I walked further, the footprints became erratic, sometimes stopping abruptly, then starting again. It felt off. The forest grew denser, the trees forming almost a wall on either side. I tried to focus on the trail, but then I realized I had no clear sense of how far I had gone or if I was even moving in the right direction. Shadows lengthened, and the sun started dipping below the trees, making the forest darker, colder. I turned back, realizing I had underestimated the trail's complexity. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The footprints I had seen weren't just random. They were behind me now. I hadn't noticed anyone near me before, but someone or something had followed me. My heart started pounding, but I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe someone was just on the same trail and had looped around. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No rustling. Just an almost suffocating silence. I started walking faster. My boots crunched against the dirt and fallen leaves, but I could hear faint footsteps following my pace. Each time I paused or slowed down, the footsteps would pause too. My stomach dropped, and I realized I had no signal on my phone. No cell service, nothing. The thought of being completely isolated, miles from any help, made a cold sweat run down my back. My hands were shaking. I gripped my pocket knife like a lifeline, even though I had no plan other than to get back to the cabin. By the time I reached the gravel road leading back to the cabin, the sun had almost disappeared. The forest was now dark, the tall trees casting long shadows that made the path almost invisible. I ran, tripping on roots, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. Every time I thought I saw a figure in the corner of my vision, I froze, then realized it was just a tree, a bush, a trick of the fading light. I reached the cabin, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I checked every window, every door. Everything was locked. The cabin felt suddenly small and vulnerable, though I had thought it would be safe. I paced for hours, checking the locks, peeking out the windows, listening. The forest around me made strange noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints at the cabin, no voices, nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed awake that night, sleeping in the corner of the room near the fireplace. Knife in hand, flashlight at my side, my heart racing every time a branch cracked outside. The next day, I decided I needed to leave. I packed my things quickly, checking the cabin thoroughly before stepping outside. The morning was calm, sunlight spilling through the trees, but I felt a constant sense of being watched. I drove down the gravel road slowly, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Halfway down, I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. They were too far to see clearly, but their posture was deliberate. I didn't stop. I kept driving, heart pounding, until I reached a small town and stopped at a gas station. Hands shaking, barely able to fill my tank. I reported what I saw to the local authorities, but by the time they arrived at the cabin later that day, there was no sign of anyone, no footprints, nothing. The forest had swallowed up any evidence, leaving me with only the memory of the fear I had felt. Weeks later, I learned from the local ranger that the area had a history of hunters and poachers who sometimes followed hikers for sport, often disappearing without a trace. The realization hit me hard. What I experienced could have been someone observing me the entire time, planning, waiting for the right moment. I had escaped by luck and caution, paying attention to the small signs, trusting my instincts. From that moment on, I never went into the forest alone. never stayed in a remote cabin without telling someone where I was, and never underestimated the quiet, calculated danger that can hide behind the beauty of isolation. Even now, when I drive past dense forests or see a cabin deep in the woods, I remember the feeling of being followed, the suffocating fear of being alone and watched. That trip was supposed to be peaceful, a few days of calm and solitude. Instead, it became a stark lesson in how quickly a situation can go from safe to terrifying, and how important it is to respect the isolation and unknown dangers of places that seem beautiful and quiet. The experience left scars I can't erase, not on my body but on my mind. Every time I close my eyes and imagine that forest, I can feel the crunch of the leaves under the unseen footsteps, the cold sweat of terror, and the overwhelming relief of finally reaching safety. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of escaping the city and spending a week alone in a cabin deep in the forest seemed perfect. I wanted silence, fresh air, and the simple routine of living without electricity and noise. The cabin was small but sturdy, with thick wooden walls and a steep roof that slanted sharply toward the back. It sat on a little clearing surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the closest town was a long drive down a winding dirt road. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies for the week, including a first aid kit, some camping gear, and a heavy flashlight. I even brought along a small hand axe I had picked up at a hardware store, thinking it might come in handy for chopping firewood or small repairs. The drive up the mountain was long and slow, winding along narrow roads that had been carved into the steep sides of hills. By the time I reached the trailhead where the cabin was located, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The last half mile to the cabin was barely more than a dirt track, overgrown with brush in places, and I had to slow down to keep from scraping the car against hidden rocks or tree roots. By the time I reached the cabin, it was almost dusk. I parked, unloaded my supplies, and felt a sudden sense of relief and excitement. There was no sound except for the wind rustling through the pines and the occasional distant caw of a crow. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that fills your lungs with a clean sting. I started by lighting the fireplace, using the kindling I had brought, and soon a small fire was crackling in the stone hearth. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and pine sap. I unpacked my gear, arranged my food, and made a simple dinner of canned beans heated over the fire. The first night was quiet and uneventful. I lay on the small cot in the corner, listening to the wind and the occasional distant sound of something moving through the forest, but nothing came close enough to worry me. I fell asleep quickly, comforted by the warmth of the fire and the isolation I had craved. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small stream nearby, and I followed it upstream for a while, noting where I could refill my water bottles. The forest was dense but not intimidating, filled with familiar sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional scurry of a small animal. I chopped some more firewood, careful to stack it neatly near the cabin so it would be dry and ready for the nights ahead. As the day wore on, I settled into a routine of cooking, cleaning, and walking around the nearby woods, feeling a sense of accomplishment and peace. I even took some notes in a small journal I had brought, detailing the sights and sounds of the forest, the way the light fell across the trees, the patterns of moss and bark. The third day, however, things began to feel different. I woke early, as usual, and went outside to start the fire. The sky was overcast, and the wind was stronger than before, whipping through the trees with a low, constant moan. As I moved around the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints near the back of the cabin. Large, heavy prints in the mud that hadn't been there the day before. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to determine if it could have been an animal, but the size and shape suggested a human. My first thought was that someone had come by while I was sleeping, but the cabin was so remote that I found it unlikely. Still, the prints were there, leading into the woods and disappearing into the trees. I followed them cautiously for a short distance, but quickly lost them among the thick undergrowth. My stomach tightened. I returned to the cabin and locked the doors and windows, checking to make sure nothing was out of place inside. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next day, I kept noticing signs of someone else's presence. I would see more footprints around the cabin, often at odd angles, as if someone had been pacing. Small items I had left outside, like a log I had been sitting on, seemed moved slightly. Once, I noticed the door to the small outhouse had been nudged open, though I was certain I had closed it. My sense of unease grew steadily. I reminded myself I had come here to be alone, that I was probably just imagining things, but there was a gnawing tension I could not shake. On the 5th day, the weather turned. A heavy storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing wind and rain that battered the cabin for hours. I stayed inside, lighting the fire early in the morning, and spent the day moving items around to keep them dry. The storm amplified my sense of isolation. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls, made me jump. That night, I heard a loud knock on the door. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Came again, 3 sharp raps, and then silence. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the door, careful not to make any sudden movements. Outside, the wind tore at the trees and rain pelted the roof, but there was no one there. Only footprints, fresh and heavy, leading into the forest. I did not sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, watching the door and listening to the storm rage outside, my mind racing with all the possible explanations, most of them worrying. The next day, I realized I could not remain passive. I had to take action if I wanted to stay safe. I took my hand axe and went to inspect the perimeter of the cabin carefully. I noted more signs of someone moving through the woods. Broken branches, flattened grass, and disturbed dirt. Whoever had been coming near the cabin was bold, and I had no idea how long they had been watching me. I fortified the cabin as best I could, placing heavy logs against the door and barricading the windows with furniture. I prepared extra water and food, just in case I needed to stay inside for several days. I also found a small rifle in the corner of the cabin left behind by the previous occupant, along with a box of ammunition. I had no experience with firearms, but in that moment, I felt it was necessary to learn quickly. I spent the afternoon examining the rifle, making sure it was loaded and operational. The safety measures, the sights, the trigger, every detail became critical in my mind. My nerves were stretched thin, but I forced myself to stay focused on practical steps rather than fear. That evening, the intruder returned. I had gone out briefly to check the firewood pile when I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A man, tall and thin, appeared from the trees. He froze when he saw me, and I froze as well, gripping the rifle tightly. His eyes met mine for a long, tense moment. Then, without a word, he turned and melted back into the forest. I did not pursue him. I went back inside and locked the doors, my hands shaking. That night, I barely slept. I stayed awake, listening, ready for any sound. Every snap of a branch outside made my pulse race. I imagined him watching, waiting for a chance to approach again. Over the next 2 days, I kept watch constantly, rarely venturing outside except to check essential supplies. I left signs of my presence around the clearing. Scattered logs, moved branches, and footprints leading away from the cabin to confuse anyone observing. I learned to listen to the forest differently, noticing subtle shifts in wind and the slightest crackle of leaves underfoot. By the 7th day, I had established a routine: early morning inspections, barricade checks, and constant vigilance. The intruder did not return, but the tension never lifted. I knew he could be anywhere, hidden, watching, patient. On the 8th day, I decided I could not stay passive any longer. I packed my supplies, leaving a note for anyone who might come after me, warning them not to enter. I planned my route down the mountain carefully, avoiding obvious trails and signs of human activity. I waited until dawn, the forest bathed in a pale, soft light, and then I set out. Every step was deliberate, my senses alert to every sound and movement. I carried the rifle, keeping it ready but concealed, my heart hammering with each rustle of leaves. The journey down was slow, exhausting, and tense. I paused frequently, listening, checking behind me, taking care to stay out of view. The forest, once peaceful, now felt like a labyrinth, full of unseen threats. After nearly 4 hours, I reached the main dirt road. I paused at the edge, scanning the trees behind me, and felt a surge of relief. No one was there. I started walking along the road, keeping a steady pace, and soon I reached my car. I checked it carefully before opening the door and climbing inside. I drove slowly, aware that any sudden noise could attract attention, but the road was empty. The city seemed impossibly far away, yet safety was within reach. After a long, tense drive, I finally reached the nearest gas station, where I stopped to breathe and collect myself. The feeling of being hunted, of constantly being observed, did not leave me immediately, but the danger had passed. I called the authorities to report the intrusions and gave them details about the cabin and the man I had seen. They promised to investigate, though I knew it would take time. In the days that followed, I tried to return to a sense of normalcy, but the experience stayed with me. I had faced a very real threat in the forest, one that tested my instincts, patience, and courage. I had prepared as best I could, relied on my own resourcefulness, and survived. Looking back, the trip was harrowing, but it also showed me the limits of my own preparedness and the importance of vigilance when alone in a remote place. I had wanted solitude and adventure, and I got it, but at a cost that left an indelible mark on my mind. The forest was still beautiful in memory, but it was no longer innocent or safe. I had learned, painfully, that danger could be patient, silent, and terrifyingly close, and that survival required more than hope. It required action, attention, and a clear mind. I drove for hours through winding roads that cut through dense forests, the kind of forest that seemed to swallow every sound except the occasional rustle of a bird or the distant groan of a tree bending under the wind. My destination was a small cabin that I had rented for a week, far from the nearest town, where I planned to spend my time alone, away from work, phones, and the constant hum of people. The map I had printed out days ago had no signs of civilization except a few small markers indicating the cabin's location. My GPS stopped working at some point halfway through the drive, and after that, I relied solely on the directions I had noted down, measuring turns by the bends in the road and the occasional creek crossing. By the time I arrived, the sun had dropped low, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin came into view almost suddenly, tucked into a clearing with a thin path leading to it. It was rustic but solid log walls, a steep roof, and a small porch that creaked slightly under my weight as I stepped out. I parked my car on the uneven ground, listening as it settled with a low metallic groan. The smell of damp earth mixed with the faint scent of pine hit me immediately, stronger than I expected, sharp and clean. I took a deep breath, feeling both relief and a subtle edge of apprehension. The isolation was real. I could hear nothing but the wind moving through the branches and the distant sound of some creek water trickling over rocks. The cabin was old but well maintained. The wood of the porch was worn smooth from years of use, and the logs had darkened with age. Inside, the air was cool and slightly musty, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke that had lingered from previous occupants. Dust motes floated in the shafts of the late afternoon light that filtered through the small, square windows. I unpacked slowly, setting my things on the simple furniture. A small wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a small stack of firewood beside it. I ran my fingers over the surface of the logs and the table, noticing the rough texture, the small cracks, and the faint stains that had soaked into the wood over years. I lit the stove and built a fire, feeling the sudden warmth spread through the cabin as the flames caught. Outside, the light dimmed rapidly, turning the clearing into a gray-shadowed expanse. I went to the window and looked out at the forest. The trees pressed in on all sides, their trunks dark and unbroken, and I realized how isolated I truly was. The sound of wind through the branches seemed louder now, sharper, carrying the occasional snapping of small branches. It wasn't frightening yet, just a sharp awareness that I was alone here. As night fell, the sounds of the forest became clearer. I could hear the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, and the constant whisper of wind through the trees. I moved around the cabin, checking that the doors and windows were secure, noting the small lock on the main door and the simple latches on the windows. I felt a faint shiver run through me, not of fear exactly, but of anticipation. Being alone here, with no one around for miles, it was impossible not to feel some tension in the back of your mind. I ate a small dinner and sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance, feeling the warmth spread through my chest and arms. Outside, the night deepened. Shadows grew darker, shapes shifting in ways that were almost imperceptible. Every now and then, a branch would fall somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp in the quiet. I could feel the stillness pressing in, the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. It was the kind of quiet where you imagine you can hear someone breathing, even though you are alone. After a while, I went to bed, feeling the comfort of the heavy blanket against my skin. The cabin settled around me, the wood creaking as it cooled, expanding and contracting with the drop in temperature. Sleep came slowly. Every small noise startled me. An owl calling, the scratch of some animal in the underbrush, even the sudden rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. I tried to remind myself that everything I could hear was natural, the normal rhythm of the forest at night, but the quiet isolation made it feel intense, like being underwater, aware of every shift and movement. The next day, I woke early, the light of dawn seeping through the window. The forest outside was wet with dew, the sunlight casting long beams between the trees. I went outside to explore the small clearing and the nearby path. The cabin sat at the edge of a small slope, with the ground falling away into a denser area of forest. I walked along the path, noting broken branches, animal tracks, and the small signs of other life hidden in the undergrowth. The forest was alive in ways I hadn't noticed before. The smell of wet earth, the sound of running water from a nearby stream, and the constant movement of birds and small creatures. It was mid-afternoon when I realized something unusual. While walking along a narrow side path, I noticed footprints, human footprints, fresh, pressed deeply into the soft ground. They were small, adult-sized, and they weren't my own. I froze, staring at them, counting the steps, noticing how they led deeper into the trees and then disappeared. My heart rate quickened. I thought about the cabin behind me, the safety it represented, and yet the idea that someone had walked this path before me, so close, so recently, made my stomach tighten. I walked back cautiously, checking behind me every few steps, but the forest seemed still again. When I returned to the cabin, I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe someone had passed by earlier in the day, perhaps a hiker or a ranger, though the area was supposed to be rarely visited. I locked the doors and windows, feeling an undercurrent of tension I couldn't shake. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though my ears were always alert to every sound. The snapping of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds or insects. The real fear began the following night. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book and eating some simple food I had brought, when I heard it. A low, deliberate snapping of branches very close to the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was moving outside. The forest felt alive with intent. I checked the door and windows. All locks were engaged. I could feel my pulse in my ears, every muscle tense, every nerve on alert. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside, circling the cabin. The forest was dark, dense, and almost impossibly silent except for the occasional sound of movement. The footprints I had seen yesterday were now unmistakable, leading directly to the cabin and stopping just at the edge of the clearing. It felt deliberate, like someone had been studying the cabin. My stomach turned. The isolation that had seemed peaceful now felt threatening. I stayed outside for a while, scanning with the flashlight, but saw nothing. Eventually, I went back inside, locked every door, and sat close to the fire, trying to steady my breathing. Over the next 2 days, the unease grew. I found more signs of someone having been near the cabin. More footprints in the soft earth, small twigs snapped along the path, and one morning, the faint imprint of a shoe on the porch that hadn't been there before. I realized I was being watched, and the thought made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I had no way of calling for help. The nearest town was hours away, and my phone had no signal. I felt trapped, alone, vulnerable. The forest that had seemed peaceful now felt like a cage. On the fourth night, it happened. I was lying awake, listening to the forest, when I heard it again. Footsteps, deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, there was no question. Someone was there, moving carefully, staying just out of sight of the windows. My mind raced. I tried to think logically, planning my next move. I had a small pocket knife, some firewood, and a few supplies, but nothing that could truly defend me if someone tried to enter. The forest was thick, the darkness total except for the small circle of light around the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped at the far edge of the clearing, and for a long time, there was silence. Then, suddenly, a branch cracked, close enough that I could hear it distinctly, and my pulse surged. I spent the rest of the night awake, flashlight in hand, sitting with my back against the wall, listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside cautiously. The forest was quiet, and there were no signs of anyone around except for the footprints leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The isolation, the forest, the constant presence of someone nearby. It was too much. I packed quickly, checking every corner, every window. My car was still where I had left it. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. The drive back to the nearest town took longer than I expected. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow crossing the road, made my heart pound. When I finally reached a gas station, I parked and took a long, shaking breath. I called the local authorities, explained what I had seen, the footprints, and the evidence of someone being near the cabin. They said they would send someone to check, though I wasn't sure how quickly anyone could reach such a remote area. Looking back, the week at the cabin felt like a lesson in how real fear can be when it is grounded in reality. There were no ghosts, no supernatural elements, no imagined fairy tale monsters. Just the knowledge that someone else had been near, watching, possibly following. The forest, the isolation, the quiet, all became instruments of tension that played on my mind relentlessly. I left with a mix of relief and lingering unease, knowing that I had escaped by luck and caution. The cabin was a beautiful place in the daylight, but the memory of those nights, of being watched and alone, stayed with me for months. I never went back, and I don't think I ever will. The forest can hide many things, and sometimes the scariest truths are the ones that are entirely human. I parked my old, rusted SUV at the small clearing that marked the start of the dirt road leading to the cabin. The sun was sinking behind the hills, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the temperature had started to drop. The air smelled faintly of wet pine and decaying leaves. I had been planning this weekend for months. Work had been relentless, my apartment suffocating, and I needed a break, a place far away from the constant noise of the city. The cabin was small, isolated, and entirely off the grid. The directions had been precise. Drive for about 20 minutes along the winding dirt road, cross a small stream, then follow the path up the hill until I reached a wooden gate. Beyond that, the cabin would appear, tucked into a clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. I remembered thinking how perfect it sounded. The drive was slow. The dirt road was uneven, with patches of mud and exposed roots. Every bump made me jolt in my seat, and the headlights barely cut through the thickening dusk. I kept my eyes peeled for wildlife. Deer often wandered along the road in this area, but there was no sign of them yet. Only the occasional flash of a small animal's eyes reflected back at me as I moved through the shadows. By the time I crossed the narrow, shallow stream, the last rays of the sun had disappeared entirely. Darkness pressed down around me. I could hear the gentle rush of water and the faint rustle of leaves in the cold evening air. The cabin appeared just as described. It was modest, wooden, darkened by years of weather, with a simple porch and a rusted tin roof. Smoke curled lazily from a small chimney, which surprised me. No one was supposed to be there this weekend, yet someone must have been keeping the fireplace warm. I left my car on the edge of the clearing and approached on foot. The boards of the porch creaked under my weight. I checked the door. Locked, of course. That was the only key I had, the one the caretaker had left me in a small lockbox at the nearby ranger station. I retrieved it, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled strongly of wood smoke and something else. Moist, earthy, like mold but mixed with the faint odor of old fabric. The interior was simple. A small kitchenette lined one wall, with a counter, a sink, and a rusted old stove. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the center, and a few shelves held jars of food, canned goods, and some basic cooking supplies. The living area had a battered couch, a single armchair, and a small wood-burning stove. In the back, a narrow hallway led to a tiny bathroom and 2 bedrooms. The air inside was warmer than outside, the result of residual heat from the fireplace. I set my backpack down, lit the fire with the leftover kindling, and began unpacking. As I organized my things, I realized just how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, no insects, just silence pressing in from all sides. The walls were thin. Every small sound seemed to echo. I walked to the window and peered outside. The forest stretched endlessly, dark and dense, shadows pooling beneath the trees. For a moment, the isolation felt exhilarating. I was completely alone, surrounded by nature, disconnected from the endless buzz of my phone and the city. But as darkness fully settled, that sense of thrill began to mix with unease. Night fell quickly. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, washing it down with water from the jug I had brought. The fire crackled and spit faint sparks, and I spent some time checking the cabin thoroughly. Everything seemed in order. No signs of forced entry, nothing broken, nothing missing. I brushed it off as just my imagination running wild in the dark. The first night was restless. I woke several times to small noises. The creak of the floorboards, the tap of a branch against the window, the faint rustle of leaves outside. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind, but as hours passed, I realized the wind had died down entirely. I could hear movements that did not fit the natural rhythm of the forest. Footsteps? Heavy, deliberate, but faint. They seemed to circle the cabin. My heart raced. I sat up in bed, clutching the flashlight I had brought, shining it through the windows and along the edge of the clearing. Nothing moved. I told myself I was imagining things, that the forest made noises that could sound like footsteps. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found broken branches near the edge of the clearing. I realized that someone, or something, had been closer than I wanted. I kept my distance from the window and stayed aware of every sound. I decided to go for a longer walk, to tire myself out and shake the nerves. I followed the path deeper into the forest, trying to focus on the details of nature to calm my mind. The further I went, the denser the forest became. I kept thinking about the broken branches and the footsteps. It was unnerving, but I told myself to remain rational. People sometimes walk through forests, and I wasn't the only one around, even if it felt like it. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach tighten. On the forest floor, partially covered by leaves, was a discarded can, torn and flattened. Near it, I saw footprints in the mud, human footprints. They were large, heavy, and uneven. Someone had been here recently. I immediately thought about the cabin. I had been alone for just over a day, and now it felt like someone had been watching me, perhaps even approaching the cabin while I was inside. The rational part of my mind said to stay calm and head back, but my heart was pounding with fear. I retraced my steps carefully, avoiding making noise, until I finally saw the clearing and the cabin. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something I had not seen before. The front door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I gripped the axe tightly and approached slowly, peering inside. Nothing looked moved. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I checked all the windows, all the doors, and secured them again, placing heavy furniture against the doors as a precaution. I realized that I could not just sit there and wait. I had to leave the next morning. The idea of spending another night here with someone potentially lurking nearby was terrifying. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the wind, the rustle of leaves, even the cracking of the wood in the cabin, made me tense. I sat near the fireplace, axe in hand, listening to the forest outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer, deliberate, and accompanied by the sound of a faint crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves and twigs. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps moved around the cabin, circling it slowly. I could not see through the dark, and I did not dare open a window or the door. I realized that I was completely vulnerable, trapped in a place with no immediate way to get help. By dawn, the footsteps stopped. Exhausted, I managed to sleep for a few hours, waking with the sun streaming through the windows. I packed everything quickly, double-checking that nothing was left behind. I walked to my car, constantly scanning the trees and underbrush for any sign of movement. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so, and I could not shake the feeling of eyes on me. When I finally reached the road, I breathed a deep sigh of relief, unlocking the car and starting the engine. Driving away, I felt the tension in my body slowly ease, but the images of the footprints and the open door stayed in my mind. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I read a local news report about a man who had been living in the woods, breaking into cabins and stealing supplies. The description fit the footprints and the signs I had seen. Realizing how close I had been, how easily it could have turned violent, filled me with a mix of relief and lingering fear. I learned to never underestimate isolation in the wilderness, how quickly it can turn from peaceful solitude into a dangerous trap. Since that trip, I have stayed away from cabins in remote forests. I still love nature, but the experience taught me the importance of preparation, awareness, and respect for the unknown presence that might be closer than you think. The forest itself is not dangerous, but people hiding in it can be, and the quiet that once felt so comforting now has a sharper edge when I think back. I never forgot the weight of fear that night, the way my mind raced with possibilities, and the relief of returning to safety. It is a lesson I carry with me every time I step into the woods, no matter how familiar or safe it may seem. I had been planning this trip for months, meticulously choosing the right cabin, packing all the essentials, and mapping out every possible route in and out of the area. It wasn't supposed to be a big trip, just a few days away from the city, away from the noise, the traffic, and the endless pressure at work. I wanted silence. I wanted isolation. I wanted to sit somewhere deep in the woods, surrounded by trees and the smell of wet earth, and just be with my own thoughts. That was the plan. I didn't expect that those thoughts would turn against me. I drove for hours, the city fading behind me as the asphalt gave way to gravel roads and then barely marked dirt tracks. The GPS signal became patchy, fading in and out until I relied on a printed map I had brought just in case. The air smelled different as I got further into the mountains, cooler and heavier, with hints of pine and damp leaves. The cabin itself was tucked away down a narrow path, almost hidden by dense trees and overgrown underbrush. When I finally arrived, the sun was just beginning to drop behind the mountains, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of rough-hewn logs with a steep roof and a stone chimney. It looked like it had been there for decades. There was a thin layer of moss on the roof, and some of the logs were darkened from years of exposure, but the structure seemed solid. There was a small porch with a wooden railing that creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car and took in the surroundings. The area was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call. No wind, no hum of insects yet, just an oppressive stillness that made the silence feel heavier. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and something else. Old, slightly musty, like it hadn't been used in a while. I had expected that. It wasn't clean by modern standards, but it was livable. A fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a stack of wood next to it. The furniture was basic. a wooden table and chairs, a couple of rickety beds in the back room, and a small kitchenette. There was a generator, but I knew it only ran for a few hours, so I would rely mostly on lanterns and flashlights. I spent the first hour just exploring, taking note of everything. The way the floorboards creaked underfoot, the position of the windows, the way the shadows fell in the late afternoon light. Every detail mattered, even if I didn't know it yet. I set up my sleeping area, unpacked my supplies, and checked the perimeter. Everything seemed secure. I made a fire in the fireplace, which took longer than I expected because the wood was damp from recent rain. Eventually, I had a small flame that crackled and cast a soft glow around the room. Outside, darkness had begun to gather, thickening the forest into a wall of black. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans and bread, and then sat in a chair near the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones. The first night was unsettling. Not in a supernatural way, there was nothing out of place, but in a deeply human, primal way. Every sound seemed magnified. A branch scraping against the cabin wall, the wind shifting through the trees, small animals rustling in the underbrush. I lay in bed listening to it all, imagining what might be out there. The isolation, which had seemed peaceful during the day, suddenly felt heavy and oppressive. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach, even though I knew logically there was nothing that could harm me. Sleep came eventually, shallow and broken, interrupted by the sound of something hitting the roof. I thought it was a branch, and that made sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I woke to a damp, overcast sky. The air smelled of wet leaves and moss. I made coffee on a small camping stove and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. I decided to explore the surrounding area, to reassure myself that I knew the landscape. I hiked along the narrow dirt trails, noting how easy it would be to get lost if I wandered too far. There were no other cabins visible, no other people in sight. The trees were thick, and the ground was uneven and slippery from overnight rain. I found a small stream, and the water was cold and clear. I drank some, washed my hands, and noted the direction back to the cabin, marking it with small sticks and rocks so I wouldn't get disoriented. Morning brought light but little comfort. I stepped outside to stretch, the cold air biting my skin, and looked around the clearing. The forest seemed peaceful, deceptively so. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept a small knife in my pocket as I explored the area immediately around the cabin. Broken branches and footprints in the soft dirt around the trees suggested that something, or someone, had been moving nearby during the night. The footprints were large, not quite human in shape, and unevenly spaced, almost as if the person had been walking with a limp or dragging a foot. My stomach tightened. I knew I had to be cautious. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I collected firewood, checked the small generator, and cleaned the cabin. Every small sound outside made me tense. Twice, I thought I saw someone standing among the trees at the edge of the clearing, but when I looked closer, there was no one. I considered leaving immediately, but the roads were muddy from last night's rain, and I did not have cell service to call for help or a tow. My isolation was absolute. The second night was worse. I could hear the footsteps again, circling the cabin, and this time, faint scratches on the walls and the roof. I checked the doors and windows repeatedly, bolting them with whatever I could find, even stacking chairs against the door. The noises continued intermittently throughout the night, each one sharper than the last. At one point, a loud thud on the roof startled me so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my back against the door, listening. By morning, I was exhausted, muscles tight and trembling, barely able to move. I resolved to leave that morning, but first I wanted to investigate. During daylight, the fear lost some of its power. I went around the cabin carefully, examining the area for clues. There were indeed footprints leading into the woods, but none leading back out. There were no signs of a campsite, no backpacks, nothing to suggest someone had set up a place to stay. Just the footprints, large and uneven. My mind raced with possibilities. Homeless people, a hunter, or worse, someone intending to cause harm? I felt my heart sink. I spent the next day preparing to leave. I cleaned and packed my things, keeping the fire low. I kept glancing at the edges of the forest, expecting to see movement. The silence was oppressive. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows lengthened, making every tree and bush appear alive. I checked my vehicle carefully, ensuring the tires weren't stuck in mud and that the engine would start. Every small noise, every snap of a twig, made me flinch. Just as I was about to leave, I saw movement. A figure emerged from the trees at the far edge of the clearing. My heart froze. I could not make out details at first, but it was tall and wore dark clothing. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if aware I was watching. I felt cornered, trapped, but I forced myself to stay calm. I got into my car quietly, starting the engine without a sound. The figure froze for a moment, watching me, then retreated into the shadows. I drove slowly down the dirt road, keeping an eye on the tree line. Nothing followed me. The forest seemed quiet again, almost normal, but I kept driving, checking mirrors, scanning the road ahead. By the time I reached the stream, I had regained some control over my nerves. I paused there briefly, breathing heavily, looking back at the cabin through the dim light. It was as if it had been waiting for me, still and silent, holding the secrets of the previous nights. The drive back to the main road was tense but uneventful. My legs were stiff, my hands still shaking, but I felt a growing sense of relief with each mile. I finally reached the paved road, the city lights in the distance, and the phone signal returned. I called the local ranger station, reporting the footprints, the presence of a figure, and the strange noises. They assured me they would send someone to check, but I had no desire to wait around. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, exhausted, my mind replaying every moment in the cabin and the surrounding forest. I never returned to that cabin. Weeks later, I heard that authorities found evidence of a trespasser living in the woods near the area, someone who had been hiding and moving cautiously for months, avoiding detection. I thought about the figure I had seen and the footprints, connecting the pieces. I realized how dangerous the isolation had been, how close I had come to a violent encounter. The experience left me shaken but wiser. I learned to respect the wilderness in a way I hadn't before. Alone and unprepared, even a small, secluded cabin could become a place of terror. I also learned to trust my instincts. The fear that had seemed irrational at the time had been real, and it had kept me alive. The isolation I had sought for peace had turned into a test of awareness and survival. From that moment on, I made sure to check in, to prepare, and never to underestimate the dangers that could hide in the quiet, still corners of the world. It began as one of those weekends I had been looking forward to for months. I had planned it meticulously, making sure I had everything I needed to spend 3 days alone in a small cabin I had rented deep in the woods. The place was far enough from the main road that you could not hear cars or voices, just the sounds of nature. I had been living a hectic life in the city, and this was my escape, a break from everything: emails, phone calls, responsibilities. I wanted silence, isolation, and the kind of solitude that makes you feel like you've been forgotten by the rest of the world. I packed my old backpack with essentials: a first aid kit, canned food, bottled water, a small camping stove, a lantern, extra batteries, blankets, a knife, and a small axe. I double-checked everything, even though I knew I had overpacked. I liked feeling prepared. The drive to the cabin took hours. I passed dense forests, fields with nothing but tall grass waving in the wind, and occasional small towns that looked as if time had forgotten them. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the clearing. It was small and made entirely of wood, with a stone chimney rising above the roof. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and no other houses nearby. It was exactly what I wanted. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the sound of leaves rustling filled the silence. I stepped inside, dropped my bag, and immediately took in every detail. The cabin was basic but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a sink and an old wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a small sofa near a fireplace. The bedroom had a single bed with a thick quilt, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the surrounding woods. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was alone exactly as I wanted. I unpacked my things slowly, enjoying the quiet rhythm of my movements. That first night, I made a simple dinner on the stove. The food tasted better than usual, even if it was just a can of beans heated up with a piece of bread. I sat by the window, watching the forest darken, listening to the sounds of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves that could only be animals moving around. It was calming, peaceful even. I lit a few candles because the lanterns felt too harsh, and I felt cozy in the flickering light. I fell asleep early, and the first night passed without incident. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the faint light of dawn filtering through the window. I made coffee on the stove and walked outside, feeling the crisp air against my skin. I explored the area around the cabin, noting a small path that led into the forest. I didn't plan to go far, just a short walk to enjoy the day. The forest was dense, with trees so tall that sunlight barely reached the ground in some areas. I moved carefully, noticing every detail. The patterns of the bark, the shape of leaves, the way the wind moved through the branches. It was peaceful, but there was a constant reminder that I was alone, that no one would find me quickly if something went wrong. As the day passed, I started to feel a small sense of unease, though I couldn't pinpoint why. There was a feeling in the back of my mind, a kind of tension I tried to ignore. I chalked it up to the unfamiliar surroundings. I returned to the cabin in the afternoon, planning to relax and read, but the forest seemed quieter than before. The normal sounds of birds and insects had slowed, and every little noise, like a branch snapping under the weight of an animal, felt louder. I tried to distract myself by chopping firewood and stacking it neatly near the stove. Physical work kept my mind occupied, but still, there was a nagging feeling that something was off. Night came again, and with it, a wind that rattled the cabin's windows. I closed them tightly, made sure the door was locked, and lit the lantern. I decided to stay near the fireplace because the flickering light made shadows dance in a way that kept my mind busy. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside. At first, I assumed it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was deliberate, slow, and heavy, like someone walking in boots. My heart started to race. I stood by the door and listened carefully. The steps stopped suddenly, as if the person, or whatever it was, had realized they were being heard. I waited, tense, holding the axe I had placed nearby. After a long minute, I convinced myself it was just an animal and went back to the fireplace, though sleep did not come easily. By midday, the unease I felt the previous night had settled into a low-level anxiety that clung to my thoughts. Everything felt wrong, and yet I couldn't articulate why. It was just the solitude, the unfamiliarity, the sense that I was completely unprotected out here. I tried to distract myself with chores, stacking firewood, sweeping the floor, and checking the windows and doors for drafts. That's when I noticed something odd. The back window had a small scratch in the glass. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there. My heart rate quickened. I ran my finger along it and confirmed it was not on the inside. I hadn't noticed it before, but I had been meticulous during the initial inspection. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a tree branch had scratched it in the wind overnight. Maybe a small animal had climbed against the glass. But deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. I checked all the other windows and doors. They were all intact. Nothing else seemed disturbed. But that scratch lingered in my mind, a silent warning that I couldn't ignore. The second night was worse than the first. I was hyper-aware of every sound. I kept the fire going longer, letting it light up the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard a footstep on the porch. I froze, listening. Nothing. I gripped the flashlight and crept to the door, peering outside. The darkness pressed in against the window, impenetrable and absolute. I couldn't see anything. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself it had to be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I didn't sleep much that night. When dawn came, I was exhausted but determined to leave the cabin if I could. I packed a bag with essentials: water, food, first aid, flashlight, matches, my phone, though I knew there would be no signal until I reached the main road. I needed to get back to civilization, to people, to safety. I stepped outside and looked around the clearing. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, partially obscured by leaves and mud, but unmistakable. Human footprints leading from the edge of the tree line toward the cabin. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. My stomach dropped. My mind raced. Someone had been here during the night. Maybe someone had been watching me. I followed the footprints to the tree line, then stopped. There was nothing else there. No sign of a person, no sound, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. I went back inside and barricaded the cabin as best as I could. I moved the table against the door, stacked firewood along the walls, anything to make myself feel safer. I knew it was temporary, but it helped. I sat near the fire, my senses on edge, waiting for morning to come. Hours passed. Nothing happened. I tried to keep myself busy, checking the perimeter again and again. The unease never left. I knew that the forest could hide a lot of things, and humans even more. I thought about my options. Leaving immediately would be risky. The roads were rough, and if someone was out here, I didn't want to encounter them in the dark. Waiting until daylight was safer, but every minute felt like an eternity. By the time the sun started to rise, the forest looked almost peaceful, deceptive in its calm. I grabbed my bag and stepped outside cautiously. I checked every direction, then decided to head back the way I came. The dirt road was narrow, winding, and partially washed out in some areas from recent rain. I moved slowly, scanning the trees and shadows. I kept thinking about the footprints, about the scratch in the window, about the unknown presence that had shared this space with me. I made it back to my car without incident, though my nerves were shredded. I locked the doors, sat inside, and took a few deep breaths. I looked back at the cabin from the gravel clearing. It seemed quiet, harmless almost, but I knew what I had experienced. Something had been there. Someone had been there. Driving back was tense. Every sound in the woods, every movement at the edge of the road, made me flinch. I stayed on the main roads as much as possible, avoiding the narrow, winding paths I had taken to get there. When I finally reached the highway and the city lights appeared on the horizon, relief washed over me like a physical weight lifting from my shoulders. I had escaped. I was safe, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about how easily someone could hide in the forest, about how fragile our sense of security really is. And even now, weeks later, I can't drive past the edge of a forest without imagining the footsteps, the scratch in the window, the feeling of being watched. I went there for solitude and I found it, but I also found a reminder of just how alone you really are out there, and how easily that solitude can turn into something terrifyingly real. I never went back to that cabin. I never will, but the memory stays, vivid and unrelenting, a lesson etched deep into my mind. The woods are quiet, but not empty, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones that don't announce themselves, the ones that watch and wait in silence, leaving only subtle traces behind. I had planned the cabin trip for months, making lists, checking supplies, and studying the maps of the area. The cabin itself was tucked deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest road or town. The thought of being alone in a remote place, disconnected from everyone, had a strange appeal. I wanted silence, a chance to escape everything, to be just me and the wilderness. I told myself I was prepared, that I had packed everything I might need. Food, water, blankets, a first aid kit, firewood, tools, a fully charged phone with a power bank, and a flashlight. But preparation, I would soon find, can never cover everything. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. I passed through stretches of highway that gave way to gravel roads, which in turn narrowed to rough dirt tracks barely wide enough for one car. The trees grew closer together as I drove deeper into the forest, their shadows long and heavy in the late afternoon light. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, rich and damp, with a faint, almost metallic tang. By the time I arrived, the sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in deep shades of orange and red. The cabin appeared suddenly, a small wooden structure nestled between thick clusters of trees, surrounded by untamed undergrowth. It looked exactly like the pictures online, but in person, it seemed smaller, more fragile, and oddly silent. No birds, no wind, no movement except for the distant flicker of the treetops swaying gently. I parked the car, unloaded my things, and approached the cabin. The wood of the porch creaked under my weight. I checked the lock on the door. It was old but sturdy, and pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of aged wood and dust. The interior was simple. A living area with a small wood-burning stove, a couch, a few chairs, a table with a single lamp, and a narrow hallway leading to a small bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was in place just as it had been in the photos, but I noticed small details that weren't visible in pictures. The faint stains on the floor near the stove, the scratches along the hallway wall, a broken tile in the bathroom. Little signs that someone had lived here before, that the cabin had history. That alone made it feel less like a retreat and more like a place with a past. I unpacked slowly, taking care to arrange everything neatly. I built a fire in the stove, the smell of burning wood filling the room, giving it warmth and light. Outside, darkness had taken hold of the forest completely. The cabin windows showed only black silhouettes of trees. The wind had picked up slightly, causing branches to tap against the glass. It was faint at first, a soft patter, but gradually it became more persistent, sharper. Every tap seemed deliberate, echoing inside my head more than outside. I settled in with a book, trying to ignore the noises outside. At first, it was just the wind and the trees, the usual forest sounds. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something else. Movement, like the rustle of leaves, but it didn't sound natural. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon, something ordinary. I turned back to the fire, convinced that my imagination was amplifying the shadows and sounds. But the quiet lingered in a way that made it heavier, almost oppressive. I went to check the locks again, running my hands over the door frame, making sure everything was secure. It was. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Night deepened, thick and heavy, pressing against the walls of the cabin. The fire dwindled to embers, and I got up to fetch more wood. That's when I heard it clearly. A footstep on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I froze mid-step, listening. Another and another. Not fast, not panicked. Measured, like someone was walking and taking their time. My heart raced. I reached for my flashlight and cautiously opened the door a crack. Nothing. The porch was empty, only the moonlight casting faint shadows of the railing. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face. There were footprints in the soft dirt of the path leading to the cabin. Just one set, large and deep. They stopped at the porch. No one had left the cabin yet, and I hadn't seen anyone arrive. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been watching, and they were still here. I went back inside, locking the door and securing the windows as best I could. I sat by the fire, keeping the light bright, staring at every corner of the room. Hours passed. The forest outside remained silent, but I could sense the presence, subtle and lingering. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist toward me. My mind raced with possibilities, all of them unpleasant. The first thoughts were about intruders, hunters, burglars, someone hiding in the woods. But then came the darker, more personal thoughts. The possibility that I might not get out without a fight, that no one would come looking until it was too late. Sleep was impossible. I dozed for short stretches, waking at the smallest noise. Once, I heard a window rattle as if someone had pressed against it, testing it. I sat up, heart pounding, looking directly at the window. The moonlight made the forest look different, shapes more menacing, the shadows longer. Then I heard a rustling at the back of the cabin, low and soft at first, then growing sharper, closer. Something or someone was moving around outside. I grabbed the heavy metal poker I kept by the stove for firewood and crept to the window, trying to catch a glimpse. Nothing visible, but the sound was unmistakable. careful, methodical steps. I circled the cabin, slow, deliberate. My hands were shaking, my breath quick. I realized I had no idea how to defend myself if they came in. My phone signal was non-existent, the forest too deep, too remote. I was alone. Hours passed like that, every minute stretching. At some point, dawn began to break, pale light creeping through the windows. I was exhausted, almost numb, but the first light made the forest less frightening. I could see clearly now, noticing small details. Broken branches, animal tracks, the remnants of what I thought were footsteps, but closer inspection suggested something different. Patterns in the dirt that didn't match normal foot placement, something uneven, almost deliberate. It dawned on me that whoever or whatever had been there wasn't random. They had a reason. They had been watching, waiting. I decided to take action. I knew I couldn't wait for something to happen. I carefully packed my essentials: water, food, the flashlight, my phone, the car keys. I checked every corner of the cabin, every window and door, before stepping outside. The forest was quiet now, almost unnaturally so. I kept to the path I had driven in on, moving cautiously, scanning the trees, every shadow a potential threat. The footprints were still visible, leading deeper into the woods in one direction and stopping at the road behind the cabin. I took a deep breath and kept moving, adrenaline propelling me forward. As I reached the clearing where my car was parked, I saw signs that someone had been near it overnight. The dirt around the tires was disturbed, scuffed as if someone had walked around, maybe even tried to move it. My stomach churned, but relief and determination mixed with fear. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Every sound from the forest made me tense. I backed down the path slowly, eyes darting to the trees, half expecting to see a figure emerge. The drive back to the main road was slow, deliberate, every turn filled with caution. I kept checking my mirrors, but there was no one, no signs of pursuit. I didn't stop until I reached the paved road, the first houses and signs of civilization stretching out ahead. By the time I arrived back in town, the sun was fully up. The tension that had been coiled inside me for hours began to loosen, though not completely. I reported the disturbance to the local authorities, showing them the footprints, the marks around the car, the disturbed ground near the cabin. They took the report seriously, mentioning that there had been reports of prowlers in the area, though nothing violent had been reported before. They promised to send patrols and investigate further, but I didn't wait to see the results. I just wanted to be away from the forest, away from that silence that had pressed in like a physical weight. I rented a small hotel room for the night, locked all the doors, and slept with the lights on. In the days that followed, I realized how close I had come to danger. The memory of the footprints, the sounds outside, the slow circling presence stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily someone could have harmed me, how vulnerable I had been, and how quickly isolation turns ordinary fear into something far more intense. I decided never to return to that cabin. The police followed up, but they never found anything conclusive. No one had broken in, no traces of intruders, only my report and the signs I had seen. The cabin remained empty afterward, a reminder that sometimes fear is real, tangible, and closer than it seems, even without any stories of ghosts or monsters. The experience changed me. I understood the fragility of being alone in a remote place, the sharp edge of silence, and the ever-present risk of being watched without ever knowing it. I never underestimated preparation again, but I also learned that some dangers can't be entirely prevented. They can only be survived. I had always liked being alone in the woods, not the kind of solitude that came with walking trails crowded with families or weekend hikers, but the deep, quiet isolation where the only sounds were my own footsteps, the wind through the trees, and the occasional distant bird call. I'd spent years saving up for a small cabin tucked into a valley far from the nearest town. It was nothing fancy. Rough-hewn logs, a pitched roof, a small porch that looked over a stream. But it was mine, and that had always been enough. I didn't even have electricity. I liked the simplicity, the rhythm of living without the constant hum of technology. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early October, when the air had that crisp bite that hinted at winter but still held the warmth of late summer days. The drive had taken longer than I expected. The last 10 miles were a gravel road so overgrown that the wheels of my car sometimes hit hidden ruts that jolted the whole vehicle. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was just starting to dip behind the ridges of the surrounding hills. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, painting everything in muted gold and gray. I spent the first hour walking around, making sure nothing had been disturbed since my last visit. The cabin was intact. The porch steps creaked just as they had the last time I'd been there, and the small woodpile I kept stacked against the sidewall looked untouched. I carried my bags inside, unpacking the bare necessities. Water was stored in large jugs, and I had brought enough canned food and dry goods to last me a week. I stacked firewood carefully near the hearth, making sure I'd have warmth at night. Night fell quickly. I lit a fire in the stove, feeling the immediate warmth fill the room. There was something comforting about the way the flames licked the metal interior of the stove, the smell of burning pine filling the cabin. Outside, the forest darkened until I could barely see the outline of the nearest trees. Owls began their distant calls, and the wind rustled through the leaves. For a moment I felt at peace, but I didn't stay at peace for long. Around 11 o'clock, I thought I heard a snapping sound outside, not a branch breaking under its own weight, but a deliberate, sharp snap, like someone stepping on dry wood. My heart kicked up. I froze, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe I had imagined it. I told myself it was nothing. The next day, I decided to do my usual routine. Fetch water from the nearby stream, chop more firewood, and walk a bit along a trail that followed the ridge behind the cabin. The stream was low, the rocks slick with moss. I filled my jug, carefully avoiding slipping. When I turned back toward the cabin, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the tree line. Just a flash, quick enough that I questioned whether I had really seen it. Person? An animal? Couldn't tell. The forest held its silence as if nothing had happened, but my stomach tightened. By the second night, I was beginning to feel uneasy. The first night, I had brushed off the snapping sound, the flicker of movement, the feeling of being watched. But tonight, it was harder to ignore. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's work, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin floor, every whistle of the wind through the logs, made me tense. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling the cabin. Not the kind of sound an animal would make. This was heavier, purposeful. I stayed frozen, listening, trying to convince myself it was the wind. But I knew better. I could hear the steps slow near the back door, pause, and then continue. My mind raced with every worst-case scenario. Someone had followed me up here. Maybe they had been watching the cabin for days, waiting until it was dark. I thought about how isolated I was. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and cell service was spotty at best. I waited until I was sure the footsteps had receded before I crept to the door. Outside, everything was dark and still. The back steps were undisturbed, the ground showing no sign of footprints. I walked around the cabin, flashlight in hand, shining into the shadows between trees. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbances, no signs that anyone had been there. I kept the lights off and tried to sleep sitting up against the wall, fire burning low. The next day, I went for a longer walk along the ridge, trying to distract myself with the beauty of the forest. I took a small axe in my pack, mostly as a precaution, though I told myself it was for cutting fallen branches or firewood. As I walked, I began noticing subtle signs that someone else had been near. There were small clearings I hadn't noticed before, with flattened grass, broken twigs, and oddly placed rocks. Some looked recent. My stomach sank. Whoever had been outside my cabin before had left signs they were there, and now it felt like they were watching me. I tried to stick to routine to not let fear overtake me. I spent the next day chopping wood, filling water, and cooking a simple meal over the stove. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time I went outside, I scanned the tree line, listened for unnatural sounds. Every shadow looked like movement, Every crack of a branch was amplified in my mind. By the third night, fear had begun to erode my ability to focus. I had moved the firewood inside, blocked the back door with a heavy chair, and even considered barricading the front. I didn't want to admit to myself that I felt trapped. The forest, once comforting in its isolation, now seemed threatening. Every animal call sounded like a warning. Every gust of wind against the cabin walls made me flinch. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. This time, I didn't just hear them, I felt them. The crunch of leaves, the tap of boots on the gravel, the sound of careful, deliberate pacing. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering. Then I heard it. A sound of something sliding against the cabin siding, slow, deliberate, like someone testing the strength of the walls. I realized I had to act. I grabbed a flashlight and the small axe I had left by the door. I couldn't call for help. My phone was dead. I couldn't drive away without first confronting the danger outside. I shined the flashlight out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. I heard a faint whisper of movement, then a shadow flicked across the far end of the clearing. Whoever it was, they were careful, deliberate. They weren't random. They were watching, waiting. My pulse raced. I realized that hiding or panicking wouldn't work. I needed to be prepared, aware, ready to defend myself if necessary. Hours passed like that. Every time I thought the steps had stopped, they returned. Every noise made me flinch. I slept in short bursts, sitting on the floor with my axe held tightly, flashlight always at the ready. Morning felt surreal. The sun filtered weakly through the trees, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe I had imagined everything. But the flattened grass, broken twigs, and small clearings outside told a different story. Someone had been out there. Someone had been circling the cabin, testing me. The fourth day, I made a plan. I couldn't stay isolated forever. I packed essential supplies, made sure the cabin was as secure as I could manage, and left in the early morning before the sun was fully up. I didn't take the gravel road I had arrived on. I followed an old logging path I had scouted months earlier, hoping it would be less predictable. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, kept me tense, but I kept moving. I felt like I was being followed, but I refused to look back. By the time I reached the main road, my car was in sight. I could breathe again. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror for signs of someone following me. Nothing. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, parking in a crowded lot, finally able to breathe without fear pressing against my chest. I called the local sheriff, reported what I had experienced, and they told me to leave the cabin alone until they could check it. They took my account seriously enough to send a deputy to inspect the property the next day. Weeks later, I returned, but only to retrieve what I could safely remove. The cabin had been untouched by the authorities. They hadn't found anyone. Nothing indicated who had been circling my home, testing my patience, invading my solitude. But I didn't go back to stay. I realized that my love for isolation had a limit. Being alone was one thing, but being watched, hunted, unsure of what human presence was near, that had changed everything. I sold the cabin shortly after, taking what I could of my belongings and leaving the rest behind. Even now, years later, I remember that fear vividly. I can recall the sound of crunching leaves under someone else's boots, the rustle of wind in the trees, the dark shapes at the edge of vision. And I remember the relief I felt when I finally escaped, when I realized that I had survived something that could have been so much worse. The cabin is gone from my life, but the memory remains. A cautionary reminder that sometimes the forest doesn't forgive curiosity and solitude, and that not all dangers are visible, not all threats are imagined. Some are very real, waiting quietly, watching. It started with the drive. I had rented a small, old cabin deep in the woods, far from the city, where the only sounds were supposed to be wind through the trees and birds in the morning. I had been looking forward to the quiet, to the chance to be alone for a few days, to think, to breathe, to escape the constant noise of my apartment and the city streets. The directions the owner sent were simple, but the last 10 miles were on a narrow dirt road, winding between dense trees that pressed close on either side. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, slanting through the branches in sharp gold lines that made long shadows across the road. The cabin itself was small but solid, made of dark, weathered wood that smelled faintly of pine and damp. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and a living room with a stone fireplace. Outside, a stack of firewood leaned against the wall, and a small porch wrapped around the front. The trees were so close I could barely see the sky. I parked the car and sat for a moment, listening. There was no sound of cars, no hum of electricity or machinery, just the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of wind through leaves. Felt peaceful at first. I carried my bags inside, setting them down in the bedroom, and took a slow tour of the place. Everything was old but clean. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the windows had a faint film of dust, but nothing was broken. I made a fire in the fireplace even though it was still light outside. I wanted to see how it worked, to feel the warmth, to settle in. The crackle of the fire was comforting, a human sound in a place that felt otherwise untouched. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the cabin grew darker. I lit the small lamps, their soft glow filling the room, and made myself a simple dinner. The quiet was heavier now, more than before. I kept noticing sounds that weren't there, or maybe they were. Branches scraping against the roof, a thump in the distance that I told myself was just a deer, the wind shifting in an unexpected way. But there was a tension in the air I couldn't shake. It was the kind of tension that creeps under your skin when you are completely alone, and you know every noise is magnified, every shadow seems to move. I went to bed early, wanting to get a good night's sleep and start fresh in the morning. The bed was firm but comfortable. I lay there, listening to the wind and the occasional snap of a branch, until sleep finally took me. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why at first. The cabin was quiet, but there was a subtle movement in the air, a feeling of being watched that made my stomach tighten. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things, that it was just the isolation, the dark. But then I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from outside. Not right at the door, not loud enough to be certain, but enough to make me freeze. I listened, holding my breath. The scratching stopped, then started again, somewhere near the back of the cabin. I wanted to get up, to look, but I was afraid. I had no idea what it could be. An animal? Possibly. But something in the way the sound moved, the irregular pattern, felt deliberate, almost careful. I forced myself to stay in bed until dawn. I didn't sleep well after that. When the first pale light came through the trees, I got up and went outside. There was no sign of anything unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing that seemed to explain the noises. The forest looked calm, ordinary. I told myself it had just been an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a bird hitting the roof. But even then, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, the awareness that something had been nearby in the dark. The next day was filled with small chores. I gathered more firewood, swept the floor, unpacked my things, and tried to immerse myself in the quiet. I took a walk along a narrow trail behind the cabin, trying to convince myself the forest was harmless. The trail was lined with thick undergrowth, and the trees pressed so close that sunlight barely touched the ground. Birds moved among the branches, rustling leaves, and I tried to focus on the sounds of life, but the air carried a stillness that made it hard to relax. Every so often, I would hear a faint snap behind me, and I would spin around, convinced someone or something was following me, only to find empty trees. I returned to the cabin exhausted, but with the sun high and the warmth of the day, I began to feel slightly safer. I made a simple lunch, then sat by the window looking at the forest. The shadows were shorter now, the wind moving lazily through the trees. I tried to read a book, but I kept glancing at the window, startled by the smallest movements. The isolation was beginning to weigh on me. I realized I had underestimated the impact of being completely alone. In the city, even when I was by myself, there were always people nearby, always noise, always a sense of the world continuing. Here, the world felt vast, indifferent, and capable of hiding things I could not see. That night, I decided to lock all the doors, even though the cabin had no lock on the back door, and block the windows with whatever I could find. The sound of the wind outside, moving branches and rustling leaves, became oppressive. Every small noise, the creak of the floorboards, the snap of a twig outside, the distant call of an animal, felt amplified. I found myself checking the doors every few minutes, a nervous habit I had never had before. My mind kept filling in the gaps, imagining figures moving just beyond the edge of the trees, hidden in shadow, watching, waiting. It was during the third night that things escalated. I had been lying in bed for hours, listening to the night sounds, when I heard it again. That scratching. This time it was closer, more deliberate, not random at all. It moved along the side of the cabin, from the back corner toward the front. My heart pounded. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly, just listened. Then came a faint knock, soft, precise, almost human. I froze. The cabin had been quiet, too quiet, and now there was something outside, moving with intention. I tried to convince myself it was a tree branch, but the rhythm of the sound, the pauses between knocks, told me otherwise. I realized then that I had no way to call for help. There was no cell service in this part of the woods. I had a flashlight and a small pocket knife, but nothing more. The car was locked, but parked 30 feet away, and if someone or something wanted to get to me, I had little defense. The feeling of being hunted, or at least observed, was suffocating. I spent the rest of the night awake, flashlight in hand, sitting against the wall near the front door. The sounds continued sporadically, scratching, thumping, the occasional knock. Nothing broke in, nothing tried the door beyond the gentle, deliberate tapping. But the knowledge that someone or something had been walking around outside, close to the cabin, made sleep impossible. The morning came slowly. I waited until the light was strong enough to see clearly before venturing outside. The ground was undisturbed, aside from my own footprints from the previous day. No tire marks, no boot prints, nothing. I combed the area as best as I could, looking for anything unusual. The forest was empty, peaceful in the sunlight, and I felt a little foolish for my fear. But the memory of the previous night lingered, a gnawing tension that would not go away. I tried to occupy myself with chores again, but I was jumpy. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed too dark. I stayed inside most of the day, checking the windows and doors constantly. I realized I couldn't stay much longer without risking my sanity. Something about being alone with the knowledge that someone or something had been outside had broken a part of my sense of safety. By the evening, I made a plan. I would leave at first light, drive back to the city, and never come back to that cabin. I gathered my things, loaded them in the car, and stayed awake through the night, too anxious to sleep. I kept a fire in the fireplace, more for comfort than warmth, and watched the dark trees pressing close to the cabin. The next morning, I left before sunrise. The forest was silent except for the wind, and the drive back felt unreal, as if I had emerged from a different world. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me along the dirt road, but the trees were empty. By the time I reached the highway, the feeling of being hunted began to fade, replaced with relief. In the city, the noise, the people, the ordinary chaos felt like safety. I called the cabin owner, canceled the remainder of my stay, and made a promise to myself never to go back. It wasn't that the cabin was haunted or magical. It was the isolation, the lack of control, the knowledge that someone could be there and I would have no way to know until it was too late. That was all it took to make a place feel terrifying. Even weeks later, I would remember the nights I spent in that cabin, lying awake while the wind whispered through the trees, hearing sounds that might have been animals, might have been nothing, and might have been someone walking just beyond the edge of vision. I would remember the relief of leaving, the first moments of city light, the hum of traffic. I never went back. I never needed to. I understood something fundamental about fear. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It wasn't the shadows. It was the knowledge that you were completely alone, exposed and powerless, in a place where the world could touch you and you could not touch it back. And that knowledge, I realized, could make an ordinary cabin in the woods the scariest place in the world. I had been planning this trip for months. After a year full of deadlines, city noise, and endless obligations, I needed a break. A real break. The cabin I rented was in the deep woods of northern Vermont, far from the nearest town. The owner's description promised isolation, quiet, and untouched nature, and that was exactly what I wanted. I packed my old backpack carefully, leaving nothing unnecessary behind, bringing only essentials. Food for a week, water, a first aid kit, extra batteries, a flashlight, and a small axe I had learned to handle over the years on my father's property. My car groaned under the weight, but I didn't care. The drive had taken nearly 6 hours, cutting through winding mountain roads that grew narrower the farther I went. I passed small, abandoned-looking towns, some with boarded-up shops and gas stations that smelled faintly of mildew and rust. The forest became denser with every mile, trees thickening, the road crumbling at the edges. Occasionally, I passed another car, but most of the time, I drove alone, windows down, listening to the sound of tires on gravel and the occasional bird call. By the time I reached the last stretch of the trail leading to the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows that made the woods feel taller, older, and almost threatening. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked behind a bend in the road. It was small, a single story, made of weathered pine logs that had darkened with age, a steep roof covered in moss, a stone chimney crumbling slightly at the edges. I parked and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp and cold, and I could hear nothing but the wind brushing through the tall pine trees. There were no other cabins in sight, no neighbors, nothing to break the silence except the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust. I pulled out the key and pushed the door open. The interior was basic. A small kitchen with a stove and a sink, a worn dining table, a small sofa, a single bed, and a wood stove for heating. There was an old bookshelf with a few books, most of them falling apart, and a cabinet with some canned goods left by the owner. Everything looked as though it had been carefully preserved but rarely used. I dropped my bag and walked around, running my fingers over the rough wood surfaces, listening to the creaks of the floor. By the time I had unpacked, it was almost dark. I built a fire in the stove, the kind that sent a warm glow across the cabin, shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, the woods were a solid black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything, where sounds are amplified and every crack or snap of a branch echoes as if the forest itself is alive. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans and a small loaf of bread, and then sat by the fire staring at the flames. I felt a strange tension building, a mix of excitement and unease. The isolation that had felt appealing during the day now pressed down on me. Night fell fully. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin with my flashlight, just to get a sense of the property. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted tree trunks, rocks, and the occasional animal tracks, deer or maybe a coyote. Everything seemed calm, yet every time I swung the light across the trees, a shadow would move, fleeting, just at the edge of vision. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the forest was full of small nocturnal creatures. The first night was restless. I woke several times to noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Each time I opened my eyes, I strained to see through the dark window. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, tall and motionless, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself again it was a trick of the mind, exhaustion amplifying the smallest detail into something more. By the second day, I had settled into a routine. I chopped firewood, cleaned the cabin, and explored the surrounding area, marking trails in my mind so I wouldn't get lost. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, sunlight filtering through the canopy, moss covering rocks and fallen logs. Birds called, a brook gurgled somewhere nearby, and I felt myself relaxing. But there was an edge to the woods. Certain areas were thick with underbrush, shadows hiding hollows and uneven ground. I stayed careful, always listening, always aware. Then, around mid-afternoon, I noticed something odd. My food supplies, Cans of beans, a bag of rice, had been moved slightly from where I left them. I thought maybe I had shifted them myself without realizing, but the arrangement was subtle. By nightfall, I noticed small footprints around the cabin. Light, muddy, too small to be mine. My stomach tightened. The footprints were fresh, heading toward the forest, then back toward the cabin. I reinforced the doors and windows, checking locks twice. I set traps along the perimeter, simple snares I had learned as a kid. I also decided to keep the axe close to the bed. Sleep that night was nearly impossible. Every snapping twig, every gust of wind, sounded like someone moving just outside. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was constant, suffocating. The following day, I left the cabin to hike a bit further, trying to see how extensive the forest was around the property. I took a map, compass, and my phone, although I knew service would be patchy. As I walked, I noticed broken branches and flattened underbrush, as if someone, or something, had passed this way recently. The feeling of unease returned. I quickened my pace but remained alert, scanning the woods. By late afternoon, I heard something behind me. A rustling, slow and deliberate. I stopped, holding my breath. The forest was silent again, but the hair on my arms stood on end. I swung my head left and right, but there was nothing. Still, I felt eyes on me, heavy and constant. I decided to turn back, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, curious but harmless. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of the front door opening slightly. My heart stopped. I sat frozen on the bed, gripping the axe. The wind had been calm, and the cabin was quiet. Slowly, I realized the door hadn't been forced. It was as if someone had quietly opened it. I crept to the window and peeked out. Shadows moved near the edge of the tree line, figures I couldn't fully make out, watching. My stomach churned. I spent the next few days in a heightened state of alert. I didn't leave the cabin after dark. I strengthened the locks, piled firewood near the doors for barricading, and kept a small fire burning constantly. I documented the footprints, measured their size, and tried to see if there was a pattern. Every day, more signs appeared. Broken branches, slight disturbances in the underbrush, small marks on the cabin siding. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were careful, methodical, and patient. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle isolation. I liked being alone, I liked being quiet, and I liked the way nature demanded nothing from you except presence. So when I found the small cabin for rent deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, I thought it would be perfect. It was late September when I arrived, and the forest had begun to shift from the lush greens of summer to the muted yellows and reds of early fall. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of crisp cold that makes your lungs ache pleasantly. The drive there had been longer than I expected. My phone had lost signal halfway through the winding dirt road that led away from the highway. I had no one to call, no GPS to rely on, just a map I had printed at home and a sense of direction that, up to this point, had always been reliable. By the time I finally saw the cabin through the trees, the sun was already dropping, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin itself was small, built entirely of weathered wood, with a tin roof that had started to rust in places. A small stone chimney jutted from one side, and smoke curled lazily from it, though no one seemed to be inside. The moment I stepped out of my car, I realized just how quiet it was. Not the quiet of a suburban night where distant cars hum and neighbors' televisions leak through the walls, but a complete, almost unnatural silence. No birds called, no leaves rustled in the wind. Even the distant sound of running water from the creek seemed muffled, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I told myself it was just the time of day, the forest adjusting to night. I unloaded my bag and locked the car, then pushed open the creaking cabin door. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and dust. There were two small rooms, one of them a combined living and kitchen space, the other a bedroom with a bed that looked like it hadn't been used in months. The kitchen had a small wood stove, a few shelves with mismatched dishes, and a cooler that might have once served as a refrigerator. There was no electricity, no running water, just the bare essentials for someone willing to rough it in the woods. I had packed enough food and water for a week, brought a battery-powered lantern, and kept a small gas can for the stove. I started by lighting the stove. The first few attempts were frustrating. The damp would smoked more than it burned, and I had to open the windows to avoid choking. But eventually, the fire caught, warm light spilling across the walls and floor. I unpacked my things, laid out my sleeping bag on the bed, and settled in for the night. Outside, the sun had disappeared entirely, and the forest was a deep, dark green, nearly black. First, nothing happened. I read a few pages from a book I had brought, drank some water, and tried to focus on how peaceful it all was. But then, as the night deepened, I started to notice small things. A branch tapping against the roof, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps on the forest floor outside the cabin. I told myself it was the wind, the usual creaks of an old building, and tried to push the thoughts away. I lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed louder in the darkness, every shadow darker. Hours later, I woke to a thud outside. My stomach clenched, and I froze, listening. The thud was followed by a dragging sound, slow, deliberate. I could hear it moving around the cabin, circling. My first thought was a bear or some other large animal. I had brought bear spray, but it was in my bag across the room. The thought of having to move quietly in case whatever it was came inside made my heart pound. I stayed completely still, every muscle tense. The sounds continued for several minutes before fading, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I couldn't go back to sleep. I sat up, lit my lantern, and checked the windows. Nothing was there. No footprints in the dirt outside, no broken branches, no indication that anything had come near. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the dragging sound had been too deliberate, too heavy for a deer or raccoon. I spent the rest of the night listening, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making me jump. Morning brought no relief. The forest was alive with the usual sounds of birds and small animals, but I still felt tense. The dragging sound had left me unnerved, a shadow hanging over everything. I decided to take a walk, partly to calm myself and partly to see if I could find any evidence of what had been outside. I took the small path leading from the cabin, a trail that disappeared into thick woods. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and I kept my eyes on the forest floor, looking for footprints. I tried to convince myself it was a person, someone else lost in the forest, maybe a hiker like me. But it was dark, and the forest muffled everything. The steps circled the clearing, sometimes stopping, sometimes resuming. Every time the firelight caught a glimpse of movement, my heart jumped. I thought about running, but my legs refused to obey. I was in a small depression near the stream, surrounded by trees, and running blindly could be just as dangerous. The fire flickered, threatening to die, and I realized I had no way to defend myself effectively. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. An aggressive person, a desperate fugitive, a predator animal. I spent hours in that half-frozen state, sitting close to the fire, clutching a thick branch like a club, listening as the steps moved around me, then vanished. Dawn eventually came, pale and gray, filtering through the trees. I could no longer hear the rustling, and my exhaustion was overwhelming. I knew I had to move to find my way back to the cabin. I had no map, only my memory of the trail and the small markers I had left behind. I chose a direction, moving cautiously, following the stream downstream. After what felt like an eternity, I finally caught sight of a familiar ridge and, eventually, the clearing where my cabin stood. Returning to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief so intense it left me dizzy. I immediately secured the doors and windows and spent the next few hours checking everything. I realized how close I had come to serious danger. Not from ghosts, but from the forest itself and the possibility of encountering someone hostile or reckless. I had underestimated the isolation. I decided to stay inside the cabin for the next day, moving minimally and keeping a careful eye on the surroundings. I checked the supplies I had, made a larger fire in the fireplace, and fortified the cabin as best I could. The following days were uneventful in comparison, but the tension lingered. Every sound outside, the wind, a distant bird, or the creak of a tree branch, triggered the memory of those steps circling me in the dark. I realized how fragile safety could be in a remote location. I avoided hiking alone again, sticking close to the cabin, and made careful mental notes of landmarks. I also kept my phone fully charged at all times, using a small solar charger I had brought along. By the end of the week, I had gained a sense of cautious confidence. I learned to move through the woods with more awareness, to recognize subtle signs in the environment, and to respect the sheer unpredictability of being alone in the wilderness. The forest was beautiful, undeniably so, but it was also indifferent to human presence. A snap of a branch, a distant scream of an animal, a hidden pitfall. Any of these could turn a pleasant retreat into a dangerous ordeal. When it came time to leave, I packed carefully, ensuring that I left the cabin exactly as I had found it. I reflected on the experience on the drive back. The fear and uncertainty I had felt in the woods had been intense, almost paralyzing, but it had also been enlightening. I had confronted my own limitations and the raw reality of isolation. I returned to the city with a sense of accomplishment, a new respect for the wilderness, and a mental clarity that only comes from surviving a situation that tests every instinct. Looking back, I realized that the scariest part wasn't a shadow, a noise, or a human threat. It was the awareness of how alone I was and how little control I had over the environment. But I had survived carefully, deliberately, and without reckless mistakes. I had learned lessons I could carry with me for the rest of my life. Respect for nature, preparedness, situational awareness, and the importance of keeping a calm mind under pressure. I had gone into the woods seeking solitude and emerged with resilience, a story of survival, and a memory that would never fade. Not because of fantasy or fiction, but because of the harsh, real, unyielding nature of the forest itself. The cabin trip became a reference point for me in life. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by routine or the pressures of the modern world, I remembered that small, creaking cabin in the woods, the narrow trail that twisted through endless trees, the cold stream, and the silent, deliberate steps circling me in the dark. I remembered the fear, the adrenaline, and the overwhelming relief of finally finding my way back. It was a reminder that danger is not always dramatic or supernatural. It can be quiet, patient, and very real. And surviving it requires nothing more than preparation, awareness, and the ability to stay calm when every instinct screams for you to run. That cabin, that forest, and that week alone became a part of me. I never felt the same reckless confidence in isolation again, but I gained something far more valuable. An unshakable respect for the world outside the city, a knowledge that I could face it, and a clear understanding that fear, when faced correctly, can teach more than comfort ever could. It started as a trip I thought would be simple. I had been planning to get away for a week, away from the noise, the traffic, the endless ringing of phones, and the pressure of work. I wanted quiet, isolation, and a chance to breathe, to wake up to nothing but the sun filtering through trees and the smell of damp earth in the morning. I had rented a small cabin deep in the forest, far from any town or road, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through thick pines and oaks. The listing had described it as cozy, remote, and perfect for a solo retreat. Looking back, I realized how little I had really considered what remote could actually mean. The drive there was long, more than I had expected. I passed signs for the nearest town, small clusters of houses that ended abruptly, leaving only dense forest. My car rattled along the dirt road, and I kept glancing at my phone to check if the GPS signal would hold. Didn't. About 30 minutes out of the town, the signal vanished completely. I shrugged it off. I didn't need it anyway, I told myself. I had packed maps, supplies, and enough food to last the week. But the loss of signal, I would later understand, was only the beginning of the unease. I reached the cabin just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the sky turning a dull orange with streaks of purple. From the outside, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. A small wooden structure with a sloping roof, a chimney that had clearly not been used recently, and a tiny porch that creaked ominously under my weight. The forest around it was thick, every tree standing close to the next, the underbrush dense enough that you could barely see 20 feet ahead. The quiet was immediate and heavy. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I had imagined. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of the faintest sound. The only noise was the occasional bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind, but even those sounded distant, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I unloaded my car quickly, more eager than I realized to get inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There was a faint, moldy smell in the corners, but it wasn't strong. I shrugged it off and set my bag down, already imagining the week I would spend reading, writing, and walking the trails nearby. There was a small kitchen, a bedroom with a simple bed, a wood stove, and a bathroom with a shower that looked functional but had clearly not been used much. The windows were old, but intact, and the door had a lock that worked, though it felt stiff. I lit a few candles on the counters and sat on the edge of the bed, taking in the quiet. It was beautiful, serene, almost like being in a photograph. But there was a weight to it, a subtle unease I couldn't shake. The first night was uneventful, though I barely slept. Every creak of the wood, every snap of a branch outside had me tensing up. I told myself it was just the house settling, or animals moving in the forest. I reminded myself that I was alone, and I liked it that way. I told myself over and over that it was safe. But by the time dawn broke, I realized my restlessness wasn't going to go away. There was something about being completely isolated that made every sound exaggerated, every shadow more menacing. I tried to distract myself by making coffee and walking around the tiny property. The air was sharp and smelled of pine resin and wet soil. I walked down the narrow dirt path that led a little ways into the forest, careful not to wander too far, and tried to imagine the next few days as peaceful and restorative. The second day, I noticed things that didn't feel right. Small details at first. The kitchen faucet dripping even though I hadn't used it. The way the wind seemed to carry voices that weren't there. Or maybe the rustle of leaves sounding too much like footsteps. I was starting to feel paranoid. I tried to reason it away. The faucet must be loose, the sounds must be animals, the paranoia must be fatigue. But as the day went on, the sensation of being watched crept in. Every time I looked out a window, I felt like there was something just outside the tree line, hiding behind the shadows of trees. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see a figure standing silently in the cabin, but there was never anyone. I started keeping the doors locked at all times, even when I stepped outside for air or to explore. The isolation began to weigh on me more heavily than I anticipated. By mid-afternoon, I realized I was jumping at every sound. The snap of a twig, the rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush, even the distant flapping of a bird. I spent that evening reinforcing the windows as best I could, placing candles in every room to avoid going outside in the dark, and moving furniture to make myself feel safer. I made a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, and sat in the small living area staring at the flickering candlelight, listening. It was then I realized that my anxiety had reached a new level. Every sound outside felt deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. My mind raced with possibilities. Hunters passing by, a lost hiker, someone following the old dirt roads. But each time I forced myself to rationalize, I reminded myself how remote this place was. It was impossible, I thought, for someone to be close without my noticing them. Still, the unease clung to me like a second skin. Night fell heavier than the previous one. The forest seemed alive in ways I hadn't noticed before. I could hear distant branches snapping, though there was no wind. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves, always in bursts, as if something moved in short, calculated steps. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the cabin's silence pressing down on me. Then I heard it. A faint scraping, like claws on wood, coming from the outside porch. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze, listening. The scraping stopped. I strained my eyes in the darkness, staring at the window that faced the porch. Nothing. My rational mind screamed at me that it must be a branch, a deer maybe, anything but a person. But my gut told me otherwise. My gut told me someone had been there, just outside, watching me. After about half an hour, I found something that made my stomach drop. Large, uneven footprints, too big for any human shoe, circling the cabin in an odd pattern. They weren't fresh, they were damp from the morning dew, but they were clear. Something had been around the cabin in the night, walking slowly, deliberately. I tried to convince myself it was a lost hiker, maybe someone camping nearby, but the pattern didn't make sense. It wasn't a path to a trail. It was a circle. Someone or something had been watching the cabin. I returned inside, my mind racing. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was a 2-hour drive through rough roads. I couldn't call anyone. My phone had no signal. I started to think about ways to secure the cabin. I moved furniture to block the doors and windows, tied a rope around the doorknob, and kept the stove fire burning for warmth. I considered spending the day in the cabin, only venturing out when I could see clearly, but every sound outside made me anxious. The next night was worse. Around midnight, I heard movement outside again. This time, it wasn't just dragging. It was deliberate footsteps, slow, cautious, circling the cabin multiple times. I held my breath, trying to make myself invisible, and watched the lantern light flicker on the walls. I could see shadows moving outside, tree branches bending as if someone, or something, was pushing through them. I felt trapped, completely exposed despite being inside a locked cabin. By the third day, I was on edge. I barely slept, ate little, and spent most of the daylight hours checking the perimeter. That morning, I found more footprints. They were larger now, deeper, and more erratic, almost like whoever it was had been pacing, getting frustrated or nervous. Something about it didn't make sense. I could tell it was a human-sized pattern, but there was a heaviness, a weight in the way the prints pressed into the soil. I began to fear that someone was watching me, not by chance, but intentionally. I considered leaving, but the road out was muddy from recent rain. My car was parked where I had left it, and it would take hours to get back to a place with signal. I had no choice but to stay until I could plan a safe exit. I started collecting items for defense. A kitchen knife, a heavy flashlight, a metal poker from the fireplace. I kept the stove fire burning at night, both for warmth and for the sense of presence it gave me. On the fourth night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, I could hear breathing. Not animal breathing, human. I pressed my back against the wall, holding the knife in my hand, listening. The breathing grew louder, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. At one point, I heard a scraping sound, like a hand dragging along the wood of the porch. I realized then that whatever it was, it knew I was inside. It knew I was awake. I stayed motionless, waiting for hours. The sounds eventually faded, but I didn't sleep again. When morning came, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I packed my things quietly, checking every window and door before leaving. I left the cabin quickly, moving through the forest carefully, listening for any sign of movement. I didn't see anyone, but I kept my senses alert. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking, my heart racing. I drove away slowly, keeping an eye on the trees. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in the nearest town. I bought a map, checked the road conditions, and called the local ranger station. I told them about the cabin, the footprints, and the strange noises. They listened, took notes, and said they would check the area. I never went back. I reported the incident to the local authorities again weeks later when I realized that no one had been seen around the cabin since. But the footprints and disturbances had stopped. In hindsight, I realized that the forest, while beautiful and quiet, had hidden dangers beyond the obvious. People can be unpredictable, and isolation makes you vulnerable in ways you can't always anticipate. I had prepared for animals, for weather, for loneliness, but I hadn't prepared for human presence. It was a terrifying reminder that solitude is a luxury, but only when it's safe. The cabin itself was eventually abandoned again, left to the elements. The forest grew over the path, hiding it from view. I never went back, and I never stayed in a remote place alone again. I carry the memory with me, a lesson carved into my mind about caution, awareness, and respect for both nature and people. Sometimes, when I see a quiet forest or a small cabin tucked away from roads, I remember the weight of those footsteps, the slow, deliberate pacing that kept me awake, the quiet fear of being watched. It's a fear I will never forget, but it's also a fear that taught me to respect the limits of isolation and the unpredictability of the world outside my door. I had been looking forward to this cabin trip for months, planning it down to the smallest detail. Life had been weighing on me heavily. Long hours at work, endless obligations, and a growing sense of isolation. I needed to get away, to be somewhere far from the noise and routine of the city. The cabin I had rented was deep in the woods, tucked into a valley between two ridges, reachable only by a narrow, twisting dirt road that vanished into the trees. The listing promised seclusion, pristine nature, and a quiet spot to reset. I had expected the occasional creaking of old timber or the wind through pine needles, but what actually awaited me was something far more unsettling. Something that etched itself into my memory with every step I took while there. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low and orange in the sky, filtering through the trees in thin, slanted beams. The cabin was exactly as advertised. A small, wooden structure with a single story, built decades ago but maintained enough to be habitable. The wood smelled faintly of pine resin and age, and a thin layer of dust covered the floorboards. It was quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional call of a crow or the distant rustle of a deer. I parked my car in a small clearing nearby, feeling a slight thrill of satisfaction at being alone, detached from everything I had been carrying. The first evening passed uneventfully. I unpacked my things, checked the supplies I had brought: food, water, a small gas stove, and firewood stacked in the corner, and made a simple dinner. I had brought a small portable heater and a kerosene lamp in case the cabin's electricity failed, but I didn't need them yet. The cabin had running water, a functional small stove, and a wood-burning fireplace. I spent the night reading and making mental notes for hikes the next day. The isolation was comfortable, almost soothing, and I felt a strange, temporary freedom from the weight of the world. The second day, I went for a long hike. The forest was dense, thick with underbrush, pine needles, and fallen branches. I followed a path I had mapped out before, trying not to go too far from the cabin, though I admit the temptation to explore was strong. The trail twisted sharply between trees, rose over a ridge, and then dipped into a narrow, moss-covered ravine. There was a smell in the air, earthy, damp, a little like decay, that reminded me of old forests in autumn. It was normal, I thought, just the smell of untouched nature. I was careful with my footing, mindful of loose rocks and hidden roots, but somewhere along the way, I lost the trail. I hadn't gone far, maybe half a mile off the path, but when I turned around, I realized the trees all looked the same. Shadows had begun to lengthen, and the sun was disappearing behind the ridge. Panic didn't hit immediately, but a tight knot of unease formed in my stomach. I tried to retrace my steps, marking trees with small scratches of bark, but the forest seemed endless, and every direction looked identical. The wind had started to rise, and distant branches cracked like tiny gunshots. I realized with a creeping dread that I had no phone signal, an oversight I had ignored when planning. I wasn't completely inexperienced in the wilderness, but there was a small voice in my head whispering that mistakes in places like this could escalate quickly. I pushed through the brush, over small fallen logs, trying to pick out landmarks, but nothing looked familiar. The sky turned a deep purple as night fell, and the forest sounds became more pronounced. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a shallow stream cutting through it. I paused to catch my breath, my chest heaving, and considered my options. Backtracking seemed impossible without knowing where I had come from. I was at the mercy of the terrain. I decided to follow the stream, thinking it might lead me to the cabin or some other sign of human presence. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones. I kept moving, stepping carefully because the ground was slick. The sun had completely disappeared, leaving me in the gray half-light of dusk. Shadows from the surrounding trees stretched unnaturally across the water. That night, I set up a small makeshift camp near the stream. I was exhausted, hungry, and my nerves were frayed. I used some dry leaves and sticks to create a small fire, enough to keep warm and ward off the animals I could imagine lurking in the darkness. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but the noises of the forest kept me alert. The wind whistled through the branches, and the stream gurgled softly nearby. I wasn't scared at first, just hyper-aware. But somewhere around midnight, something shifted. I heard a rustle beyond the firelight, a snapping of twigs, slow and deliberate, and it was closer than anything I had heard before. I froze, straining my ears. Could have been a deer, could have been nothing. But then there was another sound, heavier, more deliberate, and I realized it wasn't a deer. It was walking upright. I could hear the crunch of underbrush under deliberate steps, slow and steady, moving along the edge of the clearing.